Παραδοσιακό μέχρι το μοντέρνο στυλ. Κεραμοσκεπές και ξύλινες στέγες. Πρωτότυπες κατασκευές με τις πιο αυστηρές προδιαγραφές. Ρουσιάκης Χρήστος. Αναλαμβάνουμε στέγες με όλους τους τύπους κεραμιδιών. Στέγες με ασφαλτικά κεραμίδια.
Any objectors still no class? No. Okay, well, we'll manage. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so we are, as you all know, of course, we are starting rather late. Handily, of course, I'm down to both give welcome remarks and concluding remarks. I had some welcome remarks, but as yesterday, I'm just going to say welcome, and I will hopefully give the welcome remarks will become the concluding remarks. So that all works out quite well. I had no idea what I was going to say at the end of the day, so now I know. So that's progress. But welcome to this second panel, and it's actually the second installment of this second panel on the Spartan Constitution, the first being last year in March in the House of Lords in London. And I'm hugely delighted to welcome all of our speakers today, and we are kicking off with Professor Edward Harris today. Now, Edward Harris and I have been working together for, I think, since 2014, which is nearly a decade, and I'm horrified that I'm the sort of person now who measures things in decades. But that's life. During that time, I think a year has not gone by when I have not introduced a paper of Edward's. So I developed a sort of patter for introducing Edward, but I'm not going to do that today because I think there are very few, anyone who's interested in classical Greece will have come across, which I'm sure many of us are today, will have come across his work on all aspects of politics, society, the law, and economy. Without further ado, may I introduce Edward Harris to speak on invading countries in order to liberate their people, the Spartans and the law. Thank you very much.
Κύριε και κύριες, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι, πρώτο θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω τον Edmund για την ευγενική εισαγωγή, αλλά υπερβάλλεις λίγο. Γιατί όχι κάθε χρόνο, αλλά πολλές φορές. Και θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω την πόλη της Σπάρτας και τους φίλους μας που έχουν οργανώσει αυτό το ενδιαφέρον και σημαντικό συνέδριο. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά για τους συνάδελφους Άγγλους. Anyway, I've changed the title of this slightly, at any rate, to make it a little bit more relevant. I think there, in many ways, Spartan history has become, we heard a lot, actually, about the way Sparta has been misused, especially by Stephen Hodgkinson. I'm going to talk about a way it possibly could also have been misused. But I also want to talk briefly, actually, about a way in the events of the last few days when the former President Donald Trump has been indicted for keeping documents. I think there's another aspect of the Spartan tradition that we ought to look back to and actually kind of look and realize that Sparta has been used by right-wing figures. Well, there's a possibility there's a strand. I don't want to say it's all of it, but there's a strand that could also be used by liberals and those of us who believe very much in democracy and the rule of law. Okay. Invading countries in order to liberate their people, a Spartan invention. On 7 October 2001, the United States and several allies invaded the country of Afghanistan. The invasion was called Operation Enduring Freedom. In 2015, the military campaign was rebranded as Operation Freedom Sentinel. The task of protecting the freedom of Afghanistan cost the United States $2.313 trillion, of which over $1 trillion was spent by the Department of Defense. The war resulted in the deaths of between 176,000 to 212,000 people, including over 46,000 civilians, and made millions refugees. Despite this vast expenditure of lives and money, after almost 20 years of fighting, the United States withdrew its military forces from Afghanistan in August of 2021. The control of Afghanistan has now returned to the Taliban. In March 2003, the United States invaded the country of Iraq, this time with many fewer allies. President George Bush called the invasion Operation Iraqi Freedom and declared that, quote, the stated policy of the United States is regime change. This led to a war that lasted from March 2003 to December 2011 and resulted in the deaths of between 34,000 and 71,000 Iraqi combatants. The figures for the civilian deaths from violence range from around 100,000 to close to 1 million. The figures for a study by Brown University estimated the cost of the war for the United States at over $1 trillion. On 24 February 2022, Vladimir Putin launched a special military operation and announced an invasion of Ukraine to, quote, demilitarize and denazify the country. His aim was to liberate Ukraine from its gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis. Vasily Nebezhny, Russia's representative to the UN, stated, quote, we are not carrying out aggression against the Ukrainian people, but against the group that seized power in Kiev. Pavel Kozlenko, the director of the Museum of the Holocaust, who lost 50 members of his family to the Nazis and their allies during the Second World War, recently told a joke about two Jews standing in a street in Odessa, speaking in Yiddish. A third comes up to these two and says, guys, why are you speaking in Yiddish? To which one of the Yiddish-speaking men replied, you know, I'm scared to speak in Russian, because if I do so, Putin will show up and try to liberate us. As I hope to show in my talk today, this tradition of invading countries to liberate their people goes back to the ancient Spartans. In 508 BCE, the Spartans invaded Attica and liberated the Athenians from the tyranny of Hippias. Herodotus states in several passages in Book 5 of his histories, and they're on the handout. First, he recounts how the Athenians persuaded the Pythia at Delphi to tell any Spartans who consulted the oracle to liberate Athens. Cleomenes then invaded and besieged the tyrants, who agreed to leave under a truce. Almost a century later, the poet Aristophanes in his Lysistrata has a Spartan character remind the Athenian audience how his ancestors liberated their ancestors from slavery. We will return to the events that took place after the liberation at the end of my talk. Now, Athens was not the only community liberated from tyranny by the Spartans. In a speech by the Corinthian Socles, reported by Herodotus, the Spartans are reported to enjoy a reputation for opposing tyranny. According to Thucydides, the Spartans were responsible for putting down most tyrannies in Athens, though they are not named. Yet in his work on the malice of Herodotus, Plutarch lists several tyrants driven out by the Spartans. Spartans' reputation for liberating Greeks from tyranny was very widespread. This justification for invading a country was not something the Spartans took over from the Near East. There's been much discussion about what the Greeks owe actually to the Near Eastern civilizations, but this is not one of their legacies. In the Behistun inscription, and I've given you a passage from it on the handout, Darius uses other reasons to legitimize his conquests of other peoples. He declares that his rule over these peoples was granted to him by Ahura Mazda, and that he protects his friends and destroys his enemies. And there is no mention of liberating other peoples or protecting their freedom. Nor do we find such a justification for attacks on neighbors in the Hebrew scriptures. Finally, no leader in the Iliad or Odyssey states that he is leading his soldiers into another country to liberate its inhabitants, usually quite the opposite. Now, to understand what this slogan meant and trace its origins, we need to examine the meaning of the terms for freedom and slavery in the period before 508 and the way they were used as metaphors for types of political regimes in the period after 650 BCE. Now, this is very important because both in his Habilitationsschrift, Die Entdeckung der Freiheit, published in 1985, and his book, The Discovery of Freedom in Ancient Greece, published in 2004, Kurt Rothflaub has claimed that the concept of political liberty within a community... Okay, good. Oh, okay. Oh, good. Ignore me. Okay. Within a community did not arise until after the reforms of Ephialtes in Athens in 462 BCE, when freedom was viewed as, quote, doing whatever one wishes. According to Rothflaub, the concept of political liberty as the freedom from control by a foreign power originated during the Persian Wars. As a result, Rothflaub does not discuss or downplays the contribution of Sparta to the concept of political freedom and the role of Spartans in overthrowing slavery to a tyrant. Several advances in our understanding of Greek history achieved during the past 20 years make it necessary to take a new look at the origins of Greek views about political freedom and Sparta's role in this development. First, it has now been shown by myself in an article published in 2012 and by David Lewis in his very important book, Greek Slave Systems in Their Eastern Mediterranean Context, published in 2018. That slavery was much more extensive in the Homeric poems than Moses Finley and Rothflaub believed, and that the slaves of this period were the property of their owners in the same way as slaves in later periods. As the African scholar Malik Nadwa has shown, slavery in the Homeric poems was not paternalistic, as claimed by several scholars, but it was a very oppressive condition which all sought to avoid or escape from. And as we show, there's a vast chasm between freedom and slavery already at this period. It was not something that was produced later, as Moses Finley used to claim. These points have been taken into account in the valuable book, Historicizing Ancient Slavery, of Kostas Vlasopoulos, who was formerly actually a member of the classics department, again at Nottingham, who is now Metakomisi, and he's now at Crete. And as Carlo Peloso has recently demonstrated, free people in this period did have a concept of subjective rights, which leaders in the community were expected to respect and protect. Second, in an essay published in 2002, I showed that Solon did not abolish debt bondage, but slavery for debt. This was a view that Finley held for many years. Third, as David Lewis and I have shown in a recent essay, Solon and other lawgivers in the Archaic period created statutes not only for the elite, but for all free male members of the community who had a role in approving these laws. In Archaic Greece, the people were politically active and not simply passive spectators of aristocratic competition, as claimed by scholars like Robin Osborne, Lynn Foxall, Sarah Forsdyke, Jonathan Hall, and Josiah Ober. These rules provided substantive norms which have allocated rights and duties in the private and public sphere to all members of the community. Fourth has been shown in an important book by John Dukas and confirmed by the important studies of Stephen Hodkinson, Nino Laragi, and David Lewis. The helots of Sparta were privately owned slaves whose basic relationship with their masters differed in no significant way from that of slaves and masters in other Greek polis. Even though there were unusual restrictions on the ownership, in all essence, they were still they were owned. All these studies make a new approach to slavery and freedom as political concepts a desideratum. Now, in this paper, I'm going to adumbrate a new approach to the concept of political freedom in the Archaic period and discuss briefly Sparta's important role. My first point is the distinction between freedom and slavery of individuals is well articulated already in Homer. Secondly, Solon and other early Greek lawgivers created political institutions to implement the rule of law and to dismantle the personalized form of rule found in the Homeric poems. Despite the difference between Athens and Sparta, there is a great deal of similarity. The Spartans then used this ideology to free certain communities like Athens from tyranny, and later made it the ideological basis of the Peloponnesian League. During the Persian Wars, this dichotomy between freedom and the rule of law and slavery under despotism was mapped onto the relationship between Greeks and Persian monarchy. But this process may have begun earlier during the Ionian Revolt. The Spartans then used this terminology to challenge the Athenian Empire, which they claimed attempted to enslave its subjects. And this will be the subject of an important article forthcoming in the Revue des Études Grecques by my wife, Celine Soma. In short, Rothblatt asserted that the freedom of a community vis-a-vis other communities came first and was a product of the Persian Wars, and the political freedom of citizens within a community came second. This talk, we're going to take the actual opposite. Freedom of citizens within a community comes first. Freedom of a community from outside interference is something that comes later. Now, to start with the Iliad and the Odyssey, we'll have to start. Freedom and slavery start as a relationship between individuals, between masters and their slaves, but also as statuses within the community. First, the demois and douloi in the Iliad and the Odyssey are slaves and have the same status as the douloi and oikotai of the classical period. These individuals are the property of their masters, despotai, in the same way as douloi and oikotai of the classical period. These rights are the right to possess, the right to use, the right to manage, the right to income, the right to capital, the right to security, transmissibility, which means that you can pass on your property to your descendants. And we know this certainly happens with slaves in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then also absence of term. That means there's no limit, there's no time limit on the rights of owner, prohibition of harmful use, and liability to execution. Now, those who own slaves in the Iliad and Odyssey exercise all these rights over their slaves. They have the right to their labor, they don't pay wages, they can sell them, and they can keep the money paid. The children of slaves belong to the master, and this is clear with the children of Dolios in Odyssey 24. And when Agamemnon offers compensation to Achilles, part of the payment is made in slaves, and that's liability to execution. Rothblatt claims that more specifically the position of the unfree within society appears to have differed somewhat from later times. As we've seen, this is simply not true. The world depicted in the Iliad and the Odyssey are slave societies in the sense that the elite derived a large part of their surplus from slave labor, and this surplus allows them to obtain and maintain their leading position in the community through the distribution of largesse to their followers or autori, to members of the community, feast, sacrifices and games, and to foreign guests. The leaders have other ways of maintaining power to which we will return. But Pacha, Finlay, and Rothblatt, Greece did not become a slave society after Solon. It was already a slave society in the 7th century BCE. Finlay minimized slavery as a social and economic institution before Solon. This was not a completely original view. He was taking this without acknowledgement from Edward Meyer. You can actually take passages from The World of Odysseus and compare them with Meyer's essay of about 70 years before, and they're almost direct translations from the German. So it's not a completely original view. Rothblatt then takes this view for granted and attempts to minimize the role of freedom and slavery in the conceptual universe of society in this period. Rothblatt makes much of the rare occurrence of the word eleftheros in the epics and uses this as evidence that the concept of freedom was not important. This is fallacious and rules out the possibility that the poet may have expressed the notion of freeing with other words. In the case of Eumaeus and Philœtius, it is clear that Odysseus gave them their freedom by making them his hetairoi, a status which in the rest of the epics is always taken by free persons. The poet does not use the language of freeing, but it's clear that this is the effect of Odysseus' actions. Now, Rothblatt also claims that power resided in the private oikos, and that, quote, this helps to explain why the elite pay so little attention to freedom. Let's take two examples. In the first book of the Iliad, Chryses has come to offer ransom for his daughter Chryseis, who's been captured by Agamemnon, and is therefore his slave in precisely the same way as Chryseis is a slave of Achilles. Later in the first book, Achilles recounts to his mother, Thetis, that Chryses came with many possessions to free his daughter Chryseis. The word used to express the concept of freeing is the word lusomenos, the future participle, used elsewhere in the Iliad and later literature to express the idea of freeing slaves. Now, did Chryseis not value the freedom of his daughter very highly? Why was he prepared to pay so much? Patterson, Orlando Patterson, who very much relies on the account of Raphael, claims that only women desired their freedom in the epics, but many men were also freed from slavery by the payment of large amounts of ransom, which shows, again, that they too very much valued it. In fact, Achilles compares the status of Lycaon to death, which shows that already in the Homeric world, slaves were not simply lowly members of the community, kind of on the bottom of a big kind of ladder of statuses, but socially dead, that is, outside the community because they lacked rights, anticipating, again, the title of Orlando Patterson's book, Slavery and Social Death. Lycaon, Euedion, the friend of Lycaon, clearly considered his freedom valuable because he paid so much for his freedom. Now, for the next part of the paper, we're going to look at how the terms freedom and slavery began to be used as metaphors to characterize different political regimes. Before moving on to Solon, however, we must examine briefly the traditional methods of gaining power in the Homeric society, that is, the Greece of around 700 BCE, maybe a little before, maybe a little after, but I think the general consensus is now that social practices, we're not talking about depiction of events, but the social practices which the audience understood and needed to understand if they were going to understand the plot, basically, again, indicates. Now, this will help us to understand the transformation of ideas about power and political practices. It will also help us to place the developments in Sparta within a larger kind of pan-Hellenic context. This is one of the weaknesses of Begriffsgeschichte, an approach followed by Raphael, and was advocated by Reinhard Koselleck, who was under the rather troubling influence of Carl Schmitt. I hope you know all who he was. Namely, the tendency to analyze political ideas in isolation from political institutions. Now, first, power in the Iliad and the Odyssey. I've given you a list, and I'm just going to run through this kind of personalized form of power in the Iliad and the Odyssey. One, leaders need slaves and land and slaves to produce a surplus. Two, to gain leadership, they must defend the community, and gain slaves, they must go on raids abroad. Three, leaders of the community organize feasts and games to honor the gods and maintain good relations with the community. Four, each leader has a band of hetairoi, his personal companions who follow him into battle. This is a personal tie between the leader and each companion, and can be emotionally very deep. Five, leaders gain allies outside the community and is accompanied by rituals protected by Zeus Xenios. These are the Zenoi. Six, to create bonds between leaders both inside and outside the community. Leaders give their daughters to other powerful men and for need for money to provide large dowries. Seven, they protect the community outside. Because they protect the community against outsiders, leaders can demand payments from their followers, which serve to increase their wealth. And eight, leaders can gain prestige by their fair resolution of disputes. When they do not resolve disputes fairly, as in the case of Hesiod and his brother, they lose legitimacy in the eyes of the community. Now, because power is personalized, a leader can give it to another person. For instance, Agamemnon offers compensation to Achilles for taking Briseis. He offers to give him several towns, which he will as gifts, and those inhabitants will give him actually also protection money. Agamemnon regards his power over these communities as his personal property, which he can give to Achilles without the consent of the people in the communities. And a leader can pass on his power to his descendants. So again, this is the, again, personalized form, again, of power. Now, there's a huge transformation, but it's a gradual transformation. It begins about 650, and it's continuing down to about 500. And this system gives way to a new approach to eunomia. And the best evidence is found in inscriptions from this period, but the literary sources provide several parallels. And one of the problems, I must say, about a lot of studies of archaic Greece is that their tendency to use the very dubious literary sources. Stephen Hodgkinson has done an excellent job in drawing attention to kind of the problems, especially of late sources, again, like Plutarch. And what has been often neglected are the inscriptions, which actually reveal sort of broad patterns, and which unfortunately they were collected by the late scholar Reinhard Kerner, a collection of about 30 years ago, but they've not really been exploited. I'm just going to go quickly through these because I know my time is limited. It's on the handout. But first, there are certain kind of characteristics, and this also shows to a certain extent that Sparta, despite being different from other communities, is very much in line with the developments throughout other parts of Greece. First, there's a division of function among officials. The Greek city-state is divided into deliberative function, again, a judicial function, and the magistrates. And we find the same basic division in Athens and in Sparta, though the case of the Spartan Gerousia, deliberative and some judicial functions are combined. Two, officials are given specific and separate jurisdictions. At Athens, under Solon, they're treasurers to control public funds, the archon, the polemarch, who was first the leader of the army, and the basileus, who received charges of homicide and the naukoroi. At Sparta, even in the 6th century, there are two kings who lead the army, council of elders, deliberates about policy, the assembly, which makes decisions about major issues, and also the 5 efforts, the subject of a very important book by our friend, notre ami Nicolas Richet, who were responsible for policing and judging private cases and preside over the assembly. 3, one set of officials can act as a check on other set of officials. One of the earliest laws recorded on stone from Olympia in the 6th century grants privileges to the theokolos, a religious official, but forbids him to appropriate goods belonging to the god. If he violates this rule, he is to be judged by another official called the Ieromoros. And we find several examples. I'm not going to go through this, but this is something which is found in several places. At Sparta, again, the ephors had the power to remove from office any official who was not obeying the law, and the Gerousia had the power to try kings and other important officials. 4, an important way to prevent the concentration of power was to forbid magistrates to hold office for more than a year. We already see this in Athens, but again, archons can only serve a year. Generals at Athens can only serve a year, but they could be at least reelected. But in many places, for instance, the Cretan city of Drairos, there states that a man who holds the office of Cosmos should not be Cosmos again for another 10 years. I could give you other examples. I'm not going to go through them all. But at Sparta, the ephors, of course, were elected for a year at a time and were not re-elected. So again, in the 5th century, the Spartans elected a leader of the fleet called a navarch, but allowed him to serve for only 1 year at a time. And this created problems which they had to get over, actually, to get Lysander back in time to command at the Battle of Aegospotami. Now, one might object that at Sparta, members of the Gerousia were elected for life, but at Athens, the members of the Areopagus, are also elected for life, although the manner of selection changed from the Archaic to the Classical period. And then one of the most striking features of early Greek laws is the number of penalties laid down for magistrates who do not uphold the law. Again, many, many, many examples, again, in the inscriptions. In number 6, an important way of preventing concentration of power was to assign tasks not to a single official, but to boards of magistrates. We have several examples of boards, actually, at Athens. I won't give you again a list, but again, it's not an Athenian peculiarity. In an essay I published in 2006, I found evidence for boards of officials in many Greek polis before 400 BCE, if not before 500 BCE, including Amargos, Arcadia, Argos, Callion and Locris, Chios, Drairos, Eretria, Vorton, Halicarnassus, Lindos on Rhodes, Miletus, Naupactus, and Olympia, Teos, and Thassos. I think that's enough. Here, too, Sparta conforms to the general Greek pattern. To ensure that the laws would rule and not individuals could alter the laws, to suit their personal advantage, the Greeks often attached entrenchment clauses to their statutes to provide for stability and predictability, 2 key features of the rule of law. People have said, oh, well, the rule of law, you're importing a modern concept into the ancient evidence. No, nothing could be further from the truth. The idea that stability and predictability, that's a modern idea, but it's also something we often find present in Greek political systems. Both the Athenians and the Spartans attempted to implement the stability of law, but the procedures each state created were different and in keeping with their general political ethos. And this is the subject of an excellent recent article by Alberto Esu, which was published, again, how the Spartans and the Greeks, the Athenians, have the same basic principle, they just have different ways of enforcing it. Now, the laws of Draco and Solon and Sparta need to be viewed within this long-term development and certainly fit into these trends. Even though the laws of Sparta and the laws of Athens differed in certain ways, one should not overlook their broad similarities, nor should one take a superficial glance at Spartan practices and claim that they're how odd. As Stephen Hodgkinson has repeatedly demonstrated, Sparta was not as abnormal as some scholars have asserted. In this general context, the words eleftheria and eleftheros, freedom and free, and the word douleia, slavery, gain a new meaning, which is very important for the development of political ideas in European thought and for the concept of tyranny. In the Homeric poems, these words are used for individuals and not for the relationship between leaders and the members of the community. Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, and Priam are all free people, but the community of Ithaca is never called free, and the people of Sparta or Troy are free individuals, but not free as a collective body. Now, Solon and the lawgivers of the later Archaic period changed all this. First, Solon associates the rule of one man with slavery, fragment 9, West, and mentions the demos as a collective body falling into slavery. In Homer, the rule of one man is seen as best and necessary. As Odysseus says, tells the Achaeans in Iliad Book 2, many rulers are a bad thing, but there be one ruler, one king. End of quote. Here, the rule of one man is slavery. That is, the relationship between the ruler and the members of the community is compared as a political metaphor to the relationship between master and slave. He therefore reveals the rationale behind his measures is to avoid the concentration of power. In fragment 32, he declares that he has rejected tyranny for himself to avoid shaming his reputation or kleos. And the way to do this is by distributing power between parts of the community to achieve a balance. In fragment 5, Solon characterizes the best relationship between leaders and followers as a combination of freedom and compulsion. Just as the improper relationship between leaders and citizens was compared to slavery, here the proper relationship between leaders and citizens involves some compulsion, as is inevitable, but also is associated with, by contrast, with freedom. Now, Solon has taken terms that were used to describe relationships between individuals and then applied them to the relationship between officials and citizens. This proper relationship is achieved by creating a balance. And the aim of the new system is to protect the rights of each part of the community without allowing either to violate the rights of the other. And as we know, again, even in the Constitution of the Athenians, the laws of Solon gave even the poorest citizens the right to sit in the assembly and courts. In a famous fragment, fragment 36, Solon summarizes his achievements, and he declares that he had made the land as a whole free, which was once enslaved, another innovative use of the terms for slavery and freedom. Solon is not referring to one specific reform here, but to the effect of all of his laws on the community. In fact, a few lines below, he mentions his laws in general. He also states that he has freed individuals, but that is in contrast to the effect of his laws in general on the community as a whole. This is sometimes Aristotle in the Aristotelian Athenaean Politeia thinks this refers to the Sysacthea. It's impossible because I won't go into the arguments for this, but again, it's basically on this idea of the use of the horos and ripping up the horoi, and Aristotle thought that they were mortgage markers. It's impossible. The word horos is never used for a mortgage marker before about 370 BCE. Now, Rothbard has claimed that the idea of political freedom does not emerge until after the Persian Wars and is introduced to express the idea of freedom of the community from foreign domination. Rothbard claims that freedom is associated here with the abolition of debt bondage, but that's doubly mistaken. Of course, I mean that in the nicest possible way. First, Solon did not abolish debt bondage, which continued to exist in Attica and elsewhere, but slavery for debt. And second, the freedom here covers the entire community, not just those who fall into slavery. These passages of Solon therefore show that freedom as a political slogan is first used to contrast the rule of law and the relationship between rulers and citizens. Now, this association of freedom with the overthrow of tyranny and the establishment of isonomia is also seen in the speech of Maiandrius after the death of Polycrates of Samos. Instead of keeping power for himself, Maiandrius gives the power to the people and creates isonomia. At the same time, he sets up an altar in Temenos to Zeus Eleftherios, that is, Zeus the liberator. The connection between eleftheria and equality before the law could not be more clear. Rothbard realizes that this passage creates insuperable difficulties for his views, and he tries to argue it away. But there's no reason to doubt the existence of such an altar and such a cult. Raphael cannot deny that there was a cult of Zeus Eleftherios, but he claims that the sources distorted the explanation for its foundation. But why? How? This strikes me as special pleading. Now, it cannot be associated with the liberation from Persian rule, because that came later. And a cult of Zeus Eleftherios, founded at Plataea after the liberation of Greece, was also associated with political freedom. And when Herodotus tells us that the Spartans drove out Hippias, he uses the verb eleutheron 5 times, and those are the passages in the beginning of the handout. And here, obviously, this is regime change. This is eleftheria associated with the absence of tyranny. In other words, freedom within the community. Now, okay, and when Demaratus tells the Persian king why the Spartans will defeat him, he says that they are free under the rule of law. That is civic freedom and the absence of tyranny within the community, not the freedom of a community from foreign control. The word nomos here is not custom, but it law with formal penalties for infractions. It's been demonstrated in an article published in a volume edited by Stephen by Jean Boucat. Cowards were punished with a form of atimia in the same way as delia or cowardice was published with atimia at Athens. One might argue that this story is a pleasant fiction invented to flatter the Greek pride, yet it still shows that Herodotus thought that eleftheria was already associated with civic freedom at the time of the Persian Wars. Now, to understand what freedom achieved by the rule of law implied, it's important to examine what rights slavery to a tyrant denied. Raphael claims that for the Greeks, freedom meant the right to participate in collective decision-making and access to office, but not to individual rights like a right to a trial, right to property, right to protection against physical abuse. This view was not original, but at least goes back as far as a very famous essay, which unfortunately has had not a good effect on the study of this concept by Benjamin Constant. In his account of tyrants, however, Herodotus makes clear that the main threat is to the rights of free individuals, especially their physical security, their dignity, and their property. When Otanes denounces monarchy in the constitutional debate, he says that the monarch disrupts the ancestral laws, violates women, and puts to death people without a trial. With isonomia, the people are ruling, but they do none of these things. This implies that with isonomia, the laws are respected, free women are not victims of abuse, and people are not put to death without a trial. In this form of government, there's an alternation in office by use of the lot, and no official holds office without being accountable, and all plans are discussed in common. Now, what Isaiah Berlin called negative rights and positive rights, which he felt that negative rights were not characteristic of antiquity, I'm sorry, this passage just shows quite the opposite. This is Polycrates. Again, we see that in this passage and other passages about tyrants. Tyrants threaten they don't just take the power of the demos to deliberate collectively about public issues. They violate the rights of individuals. Therefore, the rule of law protects the rights of individuals. Again, not in the, we'll get back to that concept in a minute. And I've given there several other examples too, that tyrants are notorious for violating the rights of individuals. Now, what's revolutionary about the Spartans was that they used this ideology to advance their position first in the Peloponnese and later in the wider Greek world. Up to the middle of the 6th century, Sparta pursued a policy of conquest and enslavement in Messenia, but this policy failed first in regard to Judea and led to a shift. It is clear that by the time the Spartans expelled Hippias, they had established a reputation for driving out tyrants and for promoting freedom and the rule of law in several Greek cities. This is one of the reasons why they were the appropriate power to lead the Greek forces against the forces of Xerxes in the Persian Wars. As Demaratus is alleged to have remarked in his conversation with Xerxes, the Spartans fear the law more than the Persians fear their king. This idea of the rule of law was not a Spartan peculiarity, but a Greek ideal. And much has been written about Spartan military prowess, the reason for their leadership against Persia, but less has been written about the ideological justification for the Greeks following their leadership at Salamis and Plataea. The Greeks had confidence in the Spartans because they based their position on a shared Greek conviction. This is also how they justified their leadership against Athens in the Peloponnesian War. As Thucydides states, the Lacedaemonians had the sympathy of the Greeks because they were promising to liberate Greece. This decision won the approval of the oracle at Delphi, the center of the Greek world. And when Brasidas marched to northern Greece, Thucydides reports, quote, "For Brasidas not only behaved moderately in general, but was spreading the word everywhere that he was sent out in order to liberate Hellas. The aim of the Lacedaemonians was to, quote, go to war against the Athenians as liberators of Hellas. In fact, Brasidas, in his speech at Acanthus, refers to an oath binding Spartan officials to respect the freedom of the Greeks and not also to challenge the patrios nomus, and obviously the laws of this community. This was not an innovation at the time of the Peloponnesian War. This lay at the root of Spartan policy from the late 6th century BCE. Brasidas is quite clear that what he means by freedom, it is not simply freedom from Athenian tyranny, but also the preservation of political freedom within the community by which neither the few are enslaved to the many or the many are enslaved to the few. For him, freedom is the promise to protect the individual, political and private rights of all citizens. And he makes a similar promise at Amphipolis and makes a very important guarantee about the preservation of property rights, again, a private right. But when the Spartans attempted to invade a country to impose a tyrant, they lost legitimacy and their allies deserted them. After the Spartans expelled Hippias, fighting broke out between the two factions, one under Isagoras and the other under Cleisthenes. Finding himself on the losing side, Isagoras called on Cleomenes, who was his Xenos, guest friend under the Pisistrides. Cleomenes sent a herald demanding the banishment of the polluted, that is the descendants of the Alcmaeonids, who included Cleisthenes. The term anages is often mistranslated in several modern works as accursed, but it actually means polluted. It doesn't mean cursed. Cleisthenes then departed, but Cleomenes still came to Athens. He banished 700 households, denounced by Isagoras, and attempted to disband the council and fill the magistracies with supporters of Isagoras. When the council resisted, Cleomenes and Isagoras seized the Acropolis. After the Athenians besieged them for 2 days, Cleomenes departed under a truce. The Athenians then recalled Cleisthenes and the 700 families. Cleomenes then collected a family from the entire Peloponnese, but did not tell his allies that his aim was to set up Isagoras as tyrant. The Boeotians, Ticinoi and Hicei, and the Chalcidians then attacked from the east. The Athenians then met the Peloponnesians at Eleusis, but when the Corinthians saw that Cleomenes was acting unjustly, they withdrew, followed by King Demaratus, who disagreed with him despite his previous good relations with his fellow king. When the other allies saw the discord among allies and kings, they too departed. And in the following years, the Athenians won several successes. Later, the Spartans, alarmed by the growth of Athenian power, decided that the Athenians would be weaker under a tyrant, tried to summon back Hippias and sent for envoys from the rest of their allies. When they proposed setting up Hippias as a ruler of Athens, the Corinthian Socles gave his very famous speech denouncing tyranny and criticizing the Spartans for failing to live up to their reputation as enemies of tyranny, which shows that the reputation was well established by this point. This is one of the longest recorded speeches in the work of Herodotus, a clear indication of its importance. And after Socles finished, the rest of the allies agreed, and the Spartans were forced to back down. The legitimacy of Spartan leadership was based on a political ideal, and when the Spartans did not live up to this ideal, they could not win the consent of their allies. This was a lesson that Agesilaus failed to learn when he acquiesced in the capture of the Cadmea in 382, which the Athenian Autocles later denounced as a betrayal of Greek ideals. And that's the last passage I've given you on the handout, which is really very powerful, but shows that their hegemony was based, again, on a political ideal. Nice thing about a long handout is you can tell when the speaker's coming to the end. This blunder established a chain of events that culminated in the Spartan defeat at Leuctra in 371, the Theban invasion of the Peloponnese, and the loss of Messenia. In similar fashion, when the American President George Bush proposed an invasion of Iraq, it violated international law, as shown very well by a British scholar, Tom Bingham, the late Tom Bingham, and relied on flawed intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. The United States, too, lost legitimacy in the eyes of many allies, including France, Germany, and Italy, and did not gain the approval of the UN Security Council. The practice of invading other countries in order to free their peoples still haunts us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. That was exactly timed to 40 minutes. I'm wondering, I know we're a little bit behind, but should we do 5 minutes of questions? I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. And if you could, again, as yesterday, come up to the microphone. Would anyone like to ask? Yes, sir.
Κύριε Χάρη, συγχαρητήρια για την τοποθέτησή σας και για ό,τι έχετε κάνει μέχρι σήμερα για τη Σπάρτη και για τον αγώνα που δίνετε ώστε η ακαδημαϊκή κοινότητα να έχει περισσότερες πληροφορίες. Πιστεύετε ότι σήμερα χρειάζεται μια ηθική δικαιολογία για να εισβάλλει ένα κράτος σε ένα άλλο, όπως παραδείγματος χάρη στο Ιράκ? Όλοι ξέρουμε σήμερα ότι η εισβολή έγινε και η δολοφονία στην ουσία του Ιρακινού Προέδρου, γιατί ήταν η πρώτη χώρα που έδινε στη Δύση πετρέλαιο σε ευρώ.
Αυτό είναι διαφορετικός για τους Αμερικανούς. Το πετρέλαιο δεν είναι πολύ σημαντικό κρίμα στην αρχαιότητα. Αλλά εκεί άλλα. Έχω απάντηση είναι την ερώτηση. Μπράβο.
Η εισβολή στη Φερρυπίν που έγινε στη χώρα του Καντάφη, στη Λιβύη, η οποία διαλύθηκε, δεν έγινε για τους λόγους που μας λέγανε στην τηλεόραση κάθε μέρα, αλλά είναι γνωστό ότι ο Ούγκο Τσάβες είχε μεταφέρει στην Αγγλία το χρυσό. Ήξερε λοιπόν ότι πεθαίνει, γιατί είχε καρκίνο. Ζήτησε την επιστροφή όλου του χρυσού. Με τη μόχλευση που κάνανε, δεν μπορούσαν να το γυρίσουν το χρυσάφι πίσω και τους είχε δώσει προθεσμία μέχρι το Σεπτέμβριο. Εισβάλανε λοιπόν στη Λιβύη για να κλέψουν το χρυσάφι του Καντάφη, της Λιβύης. Η γεωπολιτική λοιπόν...
Όλα,
Γίνεται μετάφραση.
Μιλάτε για τον Καντάφη.
Ναι, λέω, αν υπάρχει σήμερα στη γεωπολιτική ηθικός λόγος για να δικαιολογήσει έναν πόλεμο, που ένας πόλεμος είναι πάντα αδίστακτος και πάντα φέρνει τεράστιες καταστροφές σε ανθρώπινο υλικό.
No, it's very.
Όποια χώρα και να δούμε.
My only point was that we're talking about an aspect of Spartan tradition. On the other hand, I just want to mention another aspect of Spartan tradition is this idea that, again, Donald Trump was, again, an ex-president being indicted, again, for retaining documents. And here it's interesting that I haven't seen any liberals actually holding up Sparta as an example. It seems to be they kind of think that Sparta is owned by the kind of far right, but I would argue that there's a kind of Republican strand that actually liberals could actually use, because we know that in Sparta, even if you were king, you could still be tried. And in this way, actually, where the prosecutor, actually Jack Smith, is continuing a long-held kind of a Spartan tradition. But I seriously doubt we're going to see any editorial writers actually kind of exploiting this connection. So I think I probably ought to finish, actually.
I think perhaps we should see some more editorial writers, and I think that would be an excellent idea. But thank you very much, Edward Harris, for a wonderful paper. And if we can move on now to our next speaker. I believe there's a handout just coming round in a second, but while the handout is distributed, I just want to, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Ellen Millender, who is Omar and Althea Hoskins Professor of Classics at Reed University. But it's also a fantastic pleasure to announce that she will be joining us next year in Nottingham thanks to a Fulbright Scholar Award. Her research has covered, I think, pretty much every area, perhaps, or arguably, of Spartan history. So again, I don't want to give too long an introduction, especially as we're short for time. But I think anyone interested in Spartan austerity, its opposite, Spartan luxury, the women in Sparta, Xenophon's view on Sparta, any of these topics, either you will have read her work or you should. So without further ado, may I please introduce Professor Melinda.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to thank, I don't know where Chrysanthi is, but I want to thank Chrysanthi. I want to thank all the members of the Nottingham community for inviting me, and also for all the people in Sparta who have helped to make this event happen. So when I was asked to write a piece on kingship, I have to say this was really pleasurable. I was very busy with other work, but it gave me the chance to mull over a number of days, thinking about sort of the issues with Spartan kingship and what I was going to say. And so today, what I'd like to do is address a common theme that runs through modern treatments of the Spartan diarchy, namely its apparently poor fit within the Spartan politeia. Seemingly un-Spartan aspects of the diarchy, like the elaborate funeral obsequies, led M.I. Finley to view it as a, quote, a persistently disruptive force of a special kind and magnitude, end quote. Rosaria Munson has similarly remarked on the Spartan kingship's, quote, imperfect integration within the Commonwealth, end quote. And Paul Cartledge has commented at length on the oddity of this institution. In my paper, I want to carry these scholars' observations much further by considering in detail the larger societal ramifications of a kingship that was, in fact, something of a cuckoo in the Spartan nest. The fact that the kings appear to have predated the Lycurgan system, of course, renders this idiom of the cuckoo imperfect. Nevertheless, I find this expression apt for my purposes because the diarchy, though a central component of Sparta's famous constitution, occupied a position as an outsider vis-a-vis the community of the homoioi. Like the unwelcome cuckoo, moreover, the kingship inevitably undermined the stability not only of the Lacedaemonians' political organization, but also of their politeia itself, their nest, so to speak. I shall argue that the diarchy was not simply disruptive or imperfectly integrated into the Spartan politeia, but was inherently incompatible with core Spartan values. At the same time, this institution was intertwined with the inherent fissures in the politeia that continuous warfare and oliganthropia exacerbated in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. While the dual kingship at times endangered Sparta's internal stability and standing abroad, the threat that this institution posed to the very fabric of Spartan society only came home to roost, I'm really milking this idiom, during the tumultuous reign of the Eurypontid Agesilaus II. Now, given its many inconsistencies, tensions, and cracks, one might wonder how any institution, including the Spartan kingship, could have been incompatible with the Spartan politeia. The kingship, however, was in several ways fundamentally out of sync even with this fractured system. Plutarch, number 1 on your handout, notes, for example, that heirs to the Agiad and Eurypontid thrones were exempt from the state's upbringing that was compulsory for all Spartan boys. Now, this exemption is striking, given that the homoioi, although unequal in many respects, experienced essentially the same paideia, which took boys out of their houses at the age of 7, housed them in barracks away from their families, organized them in groups with others of the same age class, and launched them into a compulsory, comprehensive, and grueling state-organized system of education and initiation rites that lasted for years. As Plutarch suggests, and as Cartledge has argued, this release of the royal heirs from the Lacedaemonians' famous upbringing essentially placed the hereditary kings outside of the Spartiate citizen body. Now, the exemption of the heirs apparent from the state-run upbringing however, did not simply divide Sparta's kings from the community of homoioi. It also meant that the future kings did not benefit from the educational system that focused on the production of exemplary warriors, socialized young males into all aspects of adult citizen life, and operated as the medium through which the state inculcated its core principles of uniformity, conformity, and the prioritization of the collective. One has to wonder if, when, and how the heirs to the hereditary thrones imbibed these values and acquired the sense of communal solidarity that underpinned the Spartans' unparalleled success in hoplite warfare. Equally surprising is the king's exclusion from the trials and contests built into the upbringing that tested whether a Spartan boy possessed the character and skills necessary to achieve adult warrior citizen status. The Agiad and Euryponted heirs, on the contrary, had a free pass, so to speak, to the top of the Spartan political, military, and social hierarchies without having to engage in the fierce competition that marked every stage of the enculturation process and that laid the foundations for the formation of an elite class of Spartiates. Several ancient sources provide further evidence of what I'm going to call the diarchs' external status in their treatment of the common messes, known as the Syssidia, which played a key role in the continuing enculturation of Sparta's citizen soldiers and bolstered their social and political cohesion. While it is true that the kings were similar to the homoioi in their mandated membership of a Syssidion, the evidence suggests that the kings did not have to go through the same selection process that all Spartan citizens experienced. Instead, number 2 on your handout, the kings appear to have become automatic members of an exclusive mess in which they dined together with specifically selected messmates. The kings, in addition, were awarded with double rations for the purpose of honoring their guests, a custom that allowed them to dispense royal patronage and thereby extend their influence. Even more important than the size of the royal portion was their source. Every member of the homoioi made mandated monthly contributions of sufficient agricultural produce from his estate to his Syssidion to ensure the continuation of his citizen status. The kings, on the contrary, received their double rations at state expense. Both state support and the select membership of their Syssidion would have shielded the diarchs from the realities of increasing economic stratification that forced ever more members of other Spartan Syssidia out of the citizen body. Sparta's hereditary diarchs fundamentally differ from even Sparta's wealthy elite in several ways. And I'm going to be rehearsing a little bit of evidence that many of you may know, but it's still important for me to go through it briefly. Destined from birth for supremacy, their very real wealth, uber elite lineage, and multiple opportunities to acquire even more prestige and political power as kings, military commanders, and also members of the Gerousia, allowed the more energetic and ambitious occupiers of the thrones to exert tremendous influence both at home and abroad. Unlike the homoioi, many of the homoioi, who had to work the system to acquire prestige, coveted offices, and influential positions, the heirs to the Agiad and Euryponted thrones maintained a lock on political power through the king list that Herodotus records at 7204 and 8131. Equally significant was the king's automatic position at the top of the military hierarchy, together with the powers that they enjoyed in the field and the opportunities that military leadership gave them to augment their wealth and again to dispense patronage. Hereditary access to military command also supplied the kings with invaluable symbolic capital in a state that focused so much attention, if we believe Xenophon, on military preparation, training, and organization. In addition to these advantages, the kings enjoyed a preponderance of religious power through their hereditary occupation of Sparta's 2 lone priesthoods, their many rights in connection with sacrifice, and their lone prerogative to appoint the 2 Pythioi and to maintain custody of the oracles. What truly created an unbridgeable gulf that lay between the hereditary kings and the community of homoioi, however, was the diarch's charismatic authority. The Agiad and Eurypontic kings possessed an exceptional status in relation to all Spartiates, both in life and in death, as divinely descended and sanctioned founders and guardians of Sparta. Their supermortal status accounts not only for the exemption of the royal heirs from the upbringing and consistent distance from the many levels and forms of competition that structured the Spartan polity and shaped Spartan male identity formation. The diarch's exceptionality also accounts for the symbolic importance that the Spartans attached to royal bodies, the diarch's role as the chief mediators of the Lacedaemonians' relations with their gods, and the treatment of the diarchy as both emblematic of and responsible for Sparta's welfare. The charismatic nature of the diarchy likewise explains why the Lacedaemonians' kings were exempt from the austere funerary rites that Spartiates typically received upon their deaths, whatever their differences in wealth, influence, and age. Sparta's diarchs instead received an elaborate royal burial ceremony, reported by Herodotus at 658, that reified the profound differentiation in status between the diarchs and the homoioi. This ideological spectacle, which Xenophon at Hellenica 331 describes as more splendid than that accorded to mere mortals, operated as a bridge to the heroic status that kings would enjoy after their death. Both in life and in death, in other words, Sparta's divinely descended and ultimately heroized diarchs occupied a position right below the gods on the religious political hierarchy that structured Sparta. The ramifications of this charismatic authority cannot be overstated, especially when we consider Herodotus' claim at 563-2 that the Spartans, quote, esteemed the things of the gods more highly than the things of men, end quote. Now, thanks to their structural position above and outside of the community of the homoioi, Sparta's kings were necessarily at odds with the core principles that, albeit imperfectly, lay at the heart of the Spartan politeia. Again, uniformity, conformity, and the prioritization of collective interest over those of individuals and families. Amid the internal divisions that kept the homoioi from being socially, economically, and politically equal, the diarchy constituted a permanent and very tangible reminder of the very impossibility of equality at Sparta, no matter how important this principle remained ideologically, both externally and internally. The transparency of the Agiads and Eurypontes' extraordinary social, economic, political, military, and religious power is frankly what makes their position in Sparta both so interesting and so puzzling. So for these reasons, I have to disagree with Cartledge's contention, sorry, Paul, that the diarch's charismatic authority served to induce the community of homoioi to, and this is using Paul's words, to accept and internalize, end quote, what Clifford Geertz referred to as the master fictions. In this case, those core principles that organized and sustained the Spartan socio-political order. Instead, the hereditary diarchy remained a constant thorn in the side of a system that itself failed to inculcate and to internalize in many of its citizens the Spartans' particular master fictions. At the pinnacle of this ideologically fragile system were the kings, whose charisma was at once built on and buttressed by their very exceptionality. The king's charismatic authority, instead of furthering the internalization of the ideology of the homoioi, I would argue, actually set the bar for those members of the community who proved to be poor students of Sparta's homogenizing education and or for those whose lineage, wealth, and achievements already set them apart from the herd. Now, while the exceptionality of the hereditary kings was at odds with Sparta's guiding principles and values, the inherent threat that the diarchy posed to the Spartan system only became clear when the polis experienced profound structural changes in the 5th century, especially after the Peloponnesian War. Continuous warfare and Sparta's brief hegemony created ever more opportunities for its citizens to realize their personal ambitions and desires. As the literary and archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates, elite members of the community aimed to acquire those advantages that the kings had long openly enjoyed, including their charismatic authority. We obviously cannot blame the kings for either the growing valuation and concentration of wealth or the increasing competition for foreign commands and posts. Their very existence, however, had long provided a model and roadmap for ambitious elites who now could more easily follow their lead. A good case in point, to my mind, is the Spartiatikos, whose Olympic victory in 420 surely contributed to his acquisition of numerous desirable posts that Thucydides describes, starting with his oversight of treaty negotiations with the Argives in 418-417. Among the Spartan elites who searched for ever more power and prestige, no one proved more ambitious or more dangerous than Lysander, victor over the Athenian fleet, and architect of Sparta's imperialist program. Now, despite his unparalleled attainment of personal power and wealth, Lysander, this is number 3 on your handout, ostensibly sought to open up the kingship with the expectation that his achievements made him the natural choice for royal office. Even if we question Plutarch's account, the available evidence suggests that this enterprising Spartan truly appreciated the exceptional nature of the diarchy and consequently sought to acquire heroic status and to diminish the religious power that legitimated Spartan royal authority. We can see in both the report of his attempt to obtain a fabricated Delphic oracle, reported by Diodorus Nepos and Plutarch, and his dedication of the unprecedented Nauarch's monument at Delphi, challenges to the divine sanction that the oracle granted to the Sparta's hereditary diarchy. The Nauarch monument, in its depiction of the divine crowning of the victorious Lysander, also took the Spartan commander one step closer to heroic status, as did his attempts to link himself to the semi-divine Dioscuri, long associated with Sparta's diarchs. If we are to believe the Samian historian Doris, and this is number 4 on your handout, Lysander even accepted divine worship during his lifetime. In each of these steps, Lysander demonstrated his desire for the particular form of charismatic authority that Sparta's kings enjoyed. Now, while Lysander clearly threatened the stability of Lacedaemon's politeia in his own quest for royal exceptionality, it was his former Eromenos, the future Agesilaus II, who, I would argue, posed the greatest danger to Sparta during his exceptionally long reign from 400 to circa 360 BCE. To appreciate how and why this diarch became so dangerous, we first need to consider his highly contested accession to the throne of his late half-brother, Agis II, in 400. Now, while Agesilaus prevailed over his ostensibly illegitimate half-nephew, his lameness made him a less than ideal candidate for kingship. The oracle, number 5 on your handout, that ostensibly warned the Lacedaemonians to beware of a lame kingship, and Agesilaus' likely congenital disability, could not have failed to resonate among the Spartans, given the symbolic importance I mentioned earlier that they attached to royal bodies and their linkage of the diarchy with the health of the state. Lysander's important role as kingmaker and the contested Eurypontic accession could only have posed further challenges to this new king status as one of the 2 political, military, and religious heads of state. The newly minted Agesilaus II, in other words, might have found himself deficient in that very charismatic authority that had long underpinned the exceptional position of the diarchy itself. Indeed, I would argue that the comparatively fragile state of Agesilaus' charisma explains the development of his reign, and especially the roots to prestige and power that this king took in the increasingly competitive political, social, and economic landscape of early 4th century Sparta. Perhaps as a result of the serious obstacles that he faced at the outset of his reign, Agesilaus fully exploited the other advantages that he enjoyed, beginning with the fact that he, unlike his half-brother Agis II, had gone through the traditional upbringing. Agesilaus' experience of this long process of training and socialization provided the future king with a number of very rich dividends. One benefit, according to Plutarch, Agesilaus 3:3, was the support that Agesilaus' accession to the throne received from rank and file Spartiates. If we believe Xenophon at Agesilaus 11:4 and Plutarch at Agesilaus 1.3, Agesilaus' traditional education might also explain his popularity and easy rapport with all kinds of men. Most importantly, Agesilaus' successful navigation of the upbringing with its formidable tests and many competitions might have helped to supply him with the charisma that his lameness and contested accession could only have diminished. This ideological dividend, again, this charismatic dividend, however, has to remind us that Agesilaus was no typical graduate of the Spartans' rigorous educational system. The Eurypontid prince necessarily competed with ordinary Spartiates and acquired to some degree the sense of collective enterprise that the long enculturation process fostered in many ways. He also would have received the same lessons on the key principles and virtues that underpin the community of homoioi, lessons that contributed to his fundamental conservatism and his reputation for asceticism and self-discipline. Agesilaus' participation in the upbringing, however, did not materially diminish the gulf in status that lay between rank-and-file Spartiates and members of the two semi-divine dynasties that enjoyed exclusive control over the hereditary kingship. The system's inculcation of the core principles of uniformity, conformity, and the prioritization of the collective, after all, could never have applied to the members of the royal dynasties. The education mandated for the homoioi, moreover, could not address the Agias and Eurypontid sense of entitlement, assumption of superiority, and greater concern for their own welfare and that of their respective dynasties than for the welfare of the larger community. In the hands of an enterprising king capable of taking full advantage of all the resources at his disposal, the upbringing, I would argue, could even prove to be dangerous. And no one proved to be a more adept graduate of the Spartan School of Hard Knocks than Agesilaus II. Thanks to his public schooling in the ideology of homoioi, the Eurypontid both appreciated and exploited the power of visuality and performance in the Spartan panopticon that Xenophon describes in his Lac Paul. Xenophon repeatedly depicts Agesilaus as a master performer of Spartanness, and this is handout 6 and 7, whether he was self-consciously demonstrating his obedience to the authorities upon his recall from Asia or advertising his sexual self-control. As Plutarch and Xenophon, this is number 8 on your handout, suggest in their accounts of Agesilaus' encouragement of his sister Caenisca's breeding of racehorses, the Eurypontid king sought to set himself both apart from and above competitive elite Spartiates who used their wealth to acquire greater power and prestige. Instead of engaging in the equestrian events favored by Sparta's elite, Agesilaus, it would appear, preferred to display his obedience to Lycurgus' laws in order to bolster his claim to a truer and more superior form of Spartanness than that exhibited by his compatriots. While Agesilaus appears to have imbibed and successfully performed a host of key Spartan virtues, the sources suggest that he, like many of his fellow products of the upbringing, had not actually internalized all of the principles and values that the rigorous educational system sought to inculcate. Instead, it would appear that the Eurypontid diarch actually fanned the flames of the aristocratic values and conduct that the system failed to quash. Most relevant here is the desire for an accumulation of wealth that, according to Xenophon, this is running all the way through the Lac Paul, persisted despite the Lycurgan ban against all economic and monastic enterprises. Agesilaus, of course, would always have provided a model of wealth accumulation to be emulated by ambitious elites, but he also reportedly exploited the military prerogatives that he enjoyed to enrich his friends. The source for this questionable activity is none other than Xenophon's Encomium. This is number 9 on your handout, where he recounts Agesilaus' military successes in Phrygia and consequent acquisition of a vast amount of wealth, both for himself and his friends. Xenophon further claims at Agesilaus 1:19 that the king habitually used information about plunder to ensure that his friends had the chance to acquire wealth and thereby increase their own prestige. Agesilaus' repeated enrichment of his friends clearly flouted those 3 principles that, as we have seen above, lay at the heart of the ideology of the homoioi. Especially problematic was the king's decision to prioritize the need of his friends and his own advantage over the interest of the state. As Xenophon reveals in his conclusion to this account at 119, the king's arrangements concerning plunder ultimately aided no one more than himself. Why? Because he created thereby many ardent suitors, and the Greek is really powerful, arastas, of his friendship. While Agesilaus was clearly not alone in terms of his priorities, his charismatic authority and position at the head of the political and social hierarchies that structured the state made his violation of key Spartan principles especially pernicious. As these sources on Agesilaus' reign demonstrate, the Eurypontid king strategically deployed not only his education and wealth, but also his hereditary role as a military leader and other royal prerogatives to amass an unprecedented degree of influence both at home and abroad. Xenophon tells us at several points in the Agesilaus, Plutarch tells us at Agesilaus 5, 1-2, that the Eurypontid king's extensive patronage put many Spartans into his debt. While Xenophon never explicitly faults Agesilaus' broad and consequential use of the resources at his disposal, Plutarch, and this is the last one in your handout, provides a trenchant account of the king's patronage. Even if we discount Plutarch's charges, Agesilaus' skilled deployment of patronage enabled him to pursue an aggressive foreign policy that ended disastrously on the battlefield of Leuctra in 371. And I'm now at the conclusion of my talk. If Lysander understood the ideological and political benefits of charismatic authority, his protege, Agesilaus, grasped the importance of the other advantages that the diarchs enjoyed, but which elite Spartiates increasingly exploited during the polis's brief hegemony: birth, familial connections, wealth, and the profound influence that patronage exercised on all levels of Spartan society. As we have seen, Agesilaus' skilled employment of the advantages that he enjoyed as a product of Sparta's educational system also enabled him to outdistance all rivals and to dominate Sparta politically at a real cost to the polite's health as a whole. Instead of ameliorating the most threatening aspects of Sparta's exceptional diarchy, Agesilaus' participation in the traditional upbringing, I would argue, made him only more exceptional and more dangerous. Given the other structural threats that Sparta faced in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, it is not surprising that it was in Agesilaus' reign that the inherent dangers of the kingship finally came home to roost. The Eurypontid cuckoo, in his contribution to the Lacedaemonians' loss of hegemony and irreversible slide into political irrelevance, had finally destroyed the Spartan nest. Now, I'd like to finish by pointing out just a few ways in which a study of the Spartan kingship might provide useful lessons for the practice of politics in the West, and especially in relation to the increasingly fragile U.S. economy, U.S. democracy, which keeps me up at night. In the Spartan system, we see the potential dangers of a misalignment between charismatic leadership, even though I still don't understand why Donald Trump is charismatic, but for many people in the U.S., he is deeply charismatic, okay? But what we're seeing with Agesilaus, again, as I said, the dangers of a misalignment between charismatic leadership and the state's core institutions and principles. Instead of bolstering what we might call like Kurgan values, the diarch's charismatic authority necessarily valorized exceptionality and ultimately bolstered those traditional aristocratic values that contributed significantly to Sparta's decline. Through its own celebration of lineage, wealth, and privilege, the institution of the diarchy, in a way, mapped really well onto the quotidian Sparta, warts and all, rather than onto the idealized Sparta at the center of one version of the Spartan mirage. The dangers that this intimate outsider posed to the system might never have been realized but for the many shocks to the system that Sparta experienced in 5th and early 4th centuries. And again, I would say the same thing about the US and the repeated shocks that our system has faced. A perfect storm, in a way, was created by the unexpected accession of Agesilaus II, who might have been conservative in his worldview, but was at the same time a true political entrepreneur. His political acumen is clearly visible in his successful fashioning of what I view as a new version of charisma by the advertisement of his traditional upbringing and his performance of key Spartan virtues. In addition to creating this new set of symbolic forms to justify his position, Agesilaus deftly employed patronage and all the resources at his command to essentially turn himself into the political center of Sparta, which Geertz would argue is the locus of charismatic authority. It was this profound level of influence, when combined with a limited worldview and a driving desire for fame and popularity, which is clear in Xenophon and our other sources, that made Agesilaus so dangerous in the fourth century Sparta, and so very familiar to many of us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fascinating paper, another paper that's really on the theme exactly. So we have just under 10 minutes for questions. So can I invite questions from the floor? And again, please come up to the microphone. Yes, you.
Hello, yes. Thank you for that very, very interesting talk. And you brushed over this question, I think, in your talk, and I just want to ask again, even though I think I already know the answer. But do you think that the biggest reason for the persistence and maintenance and even exploitation of this inherent inequality and exception of the kings is due to it being present in foundational myths in Spartan culture? And do you think that Lysander recognized this when he attempted to link himself to the Dioscoroi?
And I would say to the second half, absolutely with Lysander. And yes, I mean, well, but you could argue, yes, in the myths, I mean, the kings are linked with the very foundations of Sparta. They're literally, in a sense, part of Sparta's, you could argue, mythical DNA.
And they've always been separate from, in tradition, from the people that they brought over.
Absolutely. And so if you think about it, it's such an odd thing, right? But again, if you think about them predating, what comes later.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting is even with the foundation of like quote unquote, we call them Lycurgan reforms, whenever we date those two, they still remain very exceptional. And even like Xenophon, when Xenophon talks about like this, like there has to be an agreement, if you remember, between the kings on the one side and the polis on the other. So yes, they're literally that this big divide is built into the very DNA of Sparta.
And do you think that divide was, that mythical divide and even that mythical lineage was used almost as political currency in order to exploit this exception to get around not being involved in like things like the agoge and so on and so forth? Do you think that link to the mythical past was used as currency, as a currency like power almost?
I would argue they didn't have to. I think it's that positioning, that almost mythic positioning, made it so that, I mean, if you think about it, again, we have to be very careful because I hate arguments from silence, but we don't hear about contestation really until we get down to Lysander. You could argue that's a combination of so many unique circumstances, including a unique individual. But I would argue that it remained stable for so long because again, it's just taken as this is the way the system is.
Okay. Well,
Thank you for your time.
thank you very much. Steve.
Uh-oh,
would you
I
like
knew
to
it. Knew it. Gonna get my boxing gloves on. I'm ready for you, Steve.
I'd like to start by thanking you very much for a very stimulating paper. And I wouldn't be here asking you a question if I'd not been stimulated by what you'd said. I think you've drawn attention to a key issue about the nature of Spartan society. You framed it one way, but I think there's another way of framing it. You framed it in terms of core Spartan values are those values of the homoi, and then you put the kings in sort of opposition to those core values. Another way would be to say that Sparta is always maintaining a delicate balancing act, whereby it embraces different core values, those of the homoi on the one hand, and those pertaining to the royal houses on the other. And here one could put in the way that Herodotus introduces his account of the Geria given to the Spartan kings these are the Garia that the Lacedaemonians have given to their king. So the kings are integrated in a different way into the politeia. And one can see this applying in other spheres too. For example, the way that the members of the Gerizia get to vote in a different way from members of the Damas as a whole, as Alberto Esther has shown in his article. And referring back to Mike Cole's paper yesterday and an article that Edward Harris has written, this purposeful incorporation of the kings in a different way from the rest of the Spartiates is the key to Sparta's military effectiveness, in that they have a king who can exercise command and control in a way that doesn't operate in different polities. So I'd see you very rightly emphasised the problems that Aginas causes. I'd say that they were integral to this very delicate balancing act that's inherent to the Spartan system.
So in the much longer version of this paper that I actually wrote over the last couple of months, that's one of the things I addressed, Steve. Steve, I don't disagree with you. It is a very delicate balancing act. I mean, Sparta, I think as all scholars have argued, the Spartans themselves are not equal. In your piece that deals with the inherent fractures in Spartan society, we have hierarchies, right? So it's not as though the king, there is a delicate balancing act, but there's many different delicate balancing acts going on in Sparta, and I agree with you. But what I would argue is, I think when we hit the 5th century and all the sort of really foundational changes that happened to Sparta, that those balancing acts just don't work anymore. And I think one of the things is you could argue there's an integration, but to me, what I find so interesting about the kings is for people, you could argue, if you're a Spartiate and let's say that up here is like, this is what you can aspire to. That's great. The kings are always going to be outside, but once the lid comes off the pot, so to speak, when we get to the end of the 5th century and the 4th century, to me, they've always been there as a possible threat. And I agree with you that there's balancing, but I think the balancing becomes impossible in this period. So I would agree, I do not disagree with you. I don't know if that answers your question.
We have 2 more minutes, so for very brief questions. I think...
I don't have a headset, so that's going to be very problematic.
Do we have a headset?
I left mine in.
Let's go ahead.
Με συγχωρείτε που θέλετε κι εσείς να μιλήσετε. Δεν θα καθυστερώ. Ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω, καταρχήν συγχαρητήρια για τις πάρα πολύ καλές ανακοινώσεις που μας κάνατε, εξαιρετικές. Ήθελα να ρωτήσω, και πάντα έτσι ήταν στο μυαλό μου, εάν έχετε από τις πηγές που έχετε μελετήσει κάποια στοιχεία που να αναφέρονται αν οι διάρχες, οι βασιλιάδες της Σπάρτης είχαν επικοινωνία με την καθημερινή ζωή, δηλαδή με τον ποιμένα, με τον αγρότη, με τον αλλιέα, με τον στρατιώτη, κάτι παρόμοιο, μάλλον σε παρόμοιο συμπόσιο που αναφερόταν στη Μακεδονική δυναστεία, υπόθηκε ότι οι μονάρχες, οι Μακεδόνες, είχαν μια καθημερινή ζωή με τον άνθρωπο τον απλό. Αυτό. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you. That's a great question. Which so this question is getting at for the relationships, if any, between the kings and average of Spartans. Well, one, clearly they must have experience. They must be having contacts with them as soldiers. They're the leaders. And a great example. I don't know if Mike is here today, but when Mike talks about Agus's ability, right, to get the army to in a sense execute an incredibly tough maneuver, there has to be rapport and relationships between the Spartans as kings, right, and their soldiers. But in terms of like hanging, again, I'm going to use an American expression, but in terms of evidence on them having dealings with average Spartiates, we really don't have a lot of evidence, but we do when we get down to Agesilaus. And it's not just Plutarch who says this. Xenophon makes this clear as well. And again, I'm extrapolating, but the suggestion is that having gone through the upbringing, that he just has a more easy rapport, right, with your average Spartiates. Granted, he's still probably not, I mean, I think Steve and others have already, he's not going to be in probably a mess with average Spartiates, but by going through, he would have been in a cohort. And so we hear about him, for example, going down to the rivers, that wonderful, wonderful scene in Hellenica, where he's dispensing patronage. And it's not just it's patronage to all kinds of people. So the evidence becomes, I think, most clear when we get to him.
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating paper, and I think we could thank Professor Melinda. So we are running, it's like a train, we're running about 20 35 minutes past. 11:35, we'll begin again.
παραδοσιακό μέχρι το μοντέρνο στυλ. Κεραμοσκεπές και ξύλινες στέγες, πρωτότυπες κατασκευές με τις πιο αυστηρές προδιαγραφές. Ρουσιάκης Χρήστος. Αναλαμβάνουμε στέγες με όλους τους τύπους κεραμιδιών. Στέγες με ασφαλτικά κεραμίδια. Στέγες με επικάλυψη χαλκού. Αναπαλαιώσεις παραδοσιακών στεγών. Ειδικές ξύλινες κατασκευές, πέργολες. Οι κατασκευές μας σε όλη την Ελλάδα σας εξασφαλίζουν την άριστη λειτουργικότητα και εμφάνιση. Οι πέργολες μας κοσμούν τους ομορφότερους κήπους και βεράντες. Γραπτή εγγύηση για την εργασία μας. Ρουσιάκης Χρήστος, 210 83 17 064 και 693 22 98 144 και στο ίντερνετ κεραμοσκεπές.gr. Από το παραδοσιακό μέχρι το μοντέρνο στυλ. Κεραμοσκεπές και ξύλινες στέγες, πρωτότυπες κατασκευές με τις πιο αυστηρές προδιαγραφές. Ρουσιάκης Χρήστος. Αναλαμβάνουμε στέγες με όλους τους τύπους κεραμιδιών. Στέγες με ασφαλτικά κεραμίδια. Στέγες με επικάλυψη χαλκού. Αναπαλαιώσεις παραδοσιακών στεγών. Ειδικές ξύλινες κατασκευές. Πέργολες. Οι κατασκευές μας σε όλη την Ελλάδα σας εξασφαλίζουν την άριστη λειτουργικότητα και εμφάνιση. Οι πέργολες μας κοσμούν τους ομορφότερους κήπους και βεράντες. Γραπτή εγγύηση για την εργασία μας. Ρουσιάκης Χρήστος. 210 83 17 064 και 693 22 98 144 και στο ίντερνετ κεραμοσκεπές.gr.
ο χαρισμός, βαρύς αβάσταχτος καμός και πετροκαταλήτης και πετροκαταλήτης.
Όμορφη πόλη, φωνές, μουσικές, απέραντι δρόμοι, κλεμμένες ματιές. Ο ήλιος χρυσίζει, χέρια σπαρμένα, βουνά και για πια πελάγια πλωμένα. Θα γίνεις δικιά μου πριν έρθει η νύχτα. Τα χωμί χαθήκαν.
Στα αλήθινα τζαλαθήτα, ότι θωρούν πενευκούντο, γελιούνται και πιστεύκούντο. Τα ψέματα που ξέρουσι να πούσιν την αλήθεια, γλυκιά να συναφέρουσι τα πιο πικρά στολίδια. Έμαθα κι αγαπώ τα σαν τα φιλιά τα πρώτα. Τα λόγια που μαγευκούσι, που τα μισά κλειδώνουν τα και τα άλλα φανερώνουν τα. Τα ψέματα που ξέρουσι να πούσιν την αλήθεια, γλυκιά να συναφέρουσι τα πιο πικρά στολίδια. Έμαθα κι αγαπώ τα σαν τα φιλιά τα πρώτα. Πορφυρένια παπαρούνα και ζουμπούλιαζε λεφτά της αγάπης τα σημάδια, μαρτυράτε τα γραφτά της αγάπης στα σημάδια μαρτυράτε τα γραφτά. Αχ, ψευδάς που μου λάχε, αχ, ψευδάς που μου λάχε. Αν ακόμα στην καρδιά του με κλειδώνει σιγανά, να σκορπάτε τα αρώμα σας, να μυρίζουν τα βουνά. Να σκορπάτε τα αρώμα σας, να μυρίζουν τα βουνά. Αχ, ψευδάς που μου λάχε, αχ, ψευδάς που μου λάχε. Αν τυχόν και δε με θέλει κι βρενάλι να αγαπά, τώρα εμπρός μου μαραθείτε, δώστε μου τη μαχαιριά. Τώρα εμπρός μου μαραθείτε, δώστε μου τη μαχαιριά. Σύννεφων πας στον ουρανόν, θωρώ μαραζωμένο, μα τα ματούθια σου θωρούν λιοντάρι θυμωμένο. Μα τα ματούθια σου θωρούν λιοντάρι θυμωμένο.
Πάνω στο ανέμου τα φτερά
βουράσε να σε πιάσει, αρώνει σου κι αρωθήμας και σκοτεινιάζει πλάση. Αρώνει σου κι αρωθήμας και σκοτεινιάζει πλάση. Που μες στα νέφη ολόφωτος ο ήλιος νεφανίσκει, βάλισε στην αγκάλι του κι ο φως σου μαρανίσκει. Βάλισε στην αγκάλι του κι ο φως σου μαρανίσκει. Άμα διψάσεις για νερό, φέρνω να σε δροσίσω, κι αν πεθυμίσεις τον χώρο, θα ρετώ να τραουδήσω. Κι αν πεθυμίσεις τον χώρο, θα ρετώ να τραουδήσω.
διαρκής φωνάζω της και τη χαρά νηστεύω μόνο μες στην αγκάλι σου μπορώ και γαληνεύω μόνο μες στην αγκάλι σου Φίλουν το μοσχολίβανο καμνού μου το χατήρι λόγια γλυκιά μυρωδικά πέμπω σου να θυμάσαι
επληρώθηκα. χάσαμε τα όνειρά μας που χαλάσαμε να έρθουν το πρωί. Χτυπά δυνατά να τα ακούσει το ξημέρωμα να μας φέρει το φανέρωμα την Ανατολή. Με νεξέδες και ζουμπούλια και θαλάσσινα πουλιά, άμα δείτε την καλή μου χαιρετίσματα πολλά, άμα δείτε την καλή μου χαιρετίσματα πολλά, με νεξέδες και ζουμπούλια και θαλάσσινα πουλιά. Ήβαλα, πάμε γυαλό, γυαλό. Ήβαλα, μόνο εσένα αγαπώ. Αν εσύ δε μου το δώσεις το φιλί που σου ζητώ, θα στο πάρω με το ζόρι και θα είναι πιο γλυκό. Θα στο πάρω με το ζόρι και θα είναι πιο γλυκό. Αν εσύ δε μου το δώσεις το φιλί που σου ζητώ. Ήβαλα, πάμε γυαλό, γυαλό. Ήβαλα, μόνο εσένα αγαπώ. Ποιο λόγια γράφω στο χαρτί, μα κόφκω τα φτερά του. Κλειδώνω τα να με φανεί, με λύπη με χαρά του. Αισθάνθηκε ο ποταμός, θωρεί με μαραζώνει. Γεμώνουν τα μάτια του και το νερό θολώνει. Ο έρωτας ο γητεύτης, εμπάντα τσίνος νικητής, του κόσμου κυβερνήτης. Μαν τυραννός ο χωρισμός, βάρης αβάσταχτος καμός και πέτρο καταλήτης, και πέτρο καταλήτης.
Σε τόπο είσαι μακρινό, το φως μου δεν σε βρίσκει.
Η αγκάλι μου γυρεύκησε κι αγιάτρευτη μην ισχύει. Ο άνεμος ο Μερακλής χορεύκει μάνιχος του, σε μας χαρίζει τη δροσιά, μα ο πόνος δικός του. Ο έρωτας ο γητεύτης, εμπαντατσίνος νικητής, του κόσμου κυβερνήτης. Μα τυραννός ο χαρισμός, βάρης αβάσταχτος καμός και πετροκαταλήτης, και πετροκαταλήτης.
Όμορφη πόλη, φωνές μουσικές, απέραντι δρόμοι, κλεμμένες ματιές. Ο ήλιος χρυσίζει, χέρια σπαρμένα, βουνά και για πια πελάγια πλωμένα. Θα γίνεις δικιά μου πριν έρθει η νύχτα. Τα χλωμά, τα φώτα πριν ρίξουν δίχτυα. Θα γίνεις δικιά μου. Η νύχτα έφτασε, τα παράθυρα κλείσαν. Η νύχτα έπεσε, οι δρόμοι χαθήκαν.
Τα μάτια σου τα μαθήτα, στα αλήθινα τζαλαθήτα, ότι θωρούν πενευκούν το, γελιούνται και πιστεύκουν το. Τα ψέματα που ξέρουσι να πούσει την αλήθεια, γλυκιά να συναφέρουσι τα πιο πικρά στολίδια. Έμαθα κι αγαπώ τα, σαν τα φιλιά τα πρώτα. μαγεύκουσιν, τα λόγια που μαγεύκουσιν, ποτάμισα κλειδώνουν τα και τα άλλα φανερώνουν τα. Τα ψέματα που ξέρουσιν να πούσιν την αλήθεια, γλυκιά να συναφέρουσιν κάποιο πικρά στολίδια. Έμαθα κι αγαπώ τα σαν τα φιλιά τα πρώτα. Πορφυρένια παπαρούνα και ζουμπούλιαζε λεφτά της αγάπης τα σημάδια, μαρτυράτε τα γραφτά. Της αγάπης τα σημάδια, μαρτυράτε τα γραφτά. Αχ, σεβδάς που μου λάχε, αχ, σεβδάς που μου λάχε. Αν ακόμα στην καρδιά του με κλειδώνει σιγανά, να μυρίζουν τα βουνά, να σκορπάτε τα αρώμα σας, να μυρίζουν τα βουνά. Αχ, σεβδάς που μου λάχε, αχ, σεβδάς που μου λάχε. Δώστε μου τη μαχαιριά, τώρα μπρος μου μαραθείτε, δώστε μου τη μαχαιριά. Συννέφων πας των ουρανών, θωρώ μαραζωμένο, μα τα ματούθια σου θωρούν λιοντάρι θυμωμένο, μα τα ματούθια σου θωρούν λιοντάρι θυμωμένο. Πάνω στο ανέμου τα φτερά βουράσε να σε πιάσει, αρώνει σου κι αρωθήμας και σκοτεινιάζει πλάση. Αρώνει σου κι αρωθήμας και σκοτεινιάζει πλάση. στα νέφη ολόφωτος, ο ήλιος νεφανίσκει, βάλισε στην αγκάλη του κι ο φως σου μαρανίσκει. Βάλισε στην αγκάλη του κι ο φως σου μαρανίσκει. Άμα διψάσεις για νερό, φέρνω να σε δροσίσω, κι αν πεθυμίσεις τον χώρο, θα έρθω να τραγουδήσω. Κι αν πεθυμίσεις τον χώρο, θα έρθω να τραγουδήσω. Άστραψεν η Ανατολή και ρόδισεν η Δύση, για να θωρεί αγάπη μου στο φως να περπατήσει, για να θωρεί
Αρκής φωνάζω της και τη χαρά νηστεύω, μόνο μες στην αγκάλη σου μπορώ και γαληνεύω, μόνο μες στην αγκάλη σου φίλουν το μοσχολίβανο, καμνού μου το χατήρι. Λόγια γλυκιά μιλώ.
James Kierstead. We are very much a global community today because we are welcoming James from New Zealand, and later we will have Noreen Humble, who is based in Canada. So we are really crossing the globe in the CSBS. And Dr. Kierstead is well known to many of you, I'm sure, for his interests in freedom and democracy. So he's going a little bit off perhaps his usual topic, but he is also of great interest as a scholar, a very unusual example of a classicist who inhabits both worlds, two worlds simultaneously, that of an academic in Victoria University of Wellington, and also his work in policy research and analysis, particularly on the topic of academic freedom in the think tank, the New Zealand Project. So that he is very much at the center of what we aim to do as well in the CSBS, which is not just to study ancient Sparta, but to have an impact on the world outside the academy. So thank you very much, James, and we are now going to see if we can start your talk. Apologies again for the delay, but I will leave it to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction. I just lost the last bit of it. You suddenly bring it back. That's great. So thanks to Edmund for the introduction. Thanks to Edmund also for the invitation, and to Chrysanthi Galu and the other people who have organized this conference. Really sorry I can't be there, but thanks for allowing me to do this on Zoom and for helping setting it up. All right. The accumulation of all powers, wrote James Madison, the chief framer of the U.S. Constitution, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. The importance of keeping lawmaking, decision-making, and legal judgment separate, that is, the doctrine of the separation of powers, was an idea that Madison got from Montesquieu. But there's a hint of another idea here in the reference to the one, the few, and the many. This is, of course, the tripartite division of regimes that was part of the way Greeks thought about politics from the days of Pindar on, at least. In the context of the Federalist Papers, though, the series of 85 articles written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay in support of their new constitution, the words might also remind us of another idea that played a key role in the U.S. founding fathers' thinking. This is the idea of the mixed constitution, a constitution that combines all three, or sometimes just two, but mainly all three of the classical regime types. And this is an idea that goes back well beyond Montesquieu to Polybius and Aristotle. For Polybius, the three classical regime types were liable to decay from a virtuous form to a thoroughly rotten one. And he compares the process to a ship's timbers being eaten by woodworms. Monarchy for Polybius will inevitably devolve into tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, and democracy into ochlocracy, or mob rule. In view of this, Lycurgus did well, according to Polybius, to foresee this and plan accordingly, combining together, and I quote, all the excellences and distinctive features of the best constitutions, that no part should become unduly predominant, and be perverted into its kindred vice, and that, each power being checked by the others, no one part should turn the scale or decisively outbalance the others, but that by being accurately adjusted in an exact equilibrium, the whole might remain long steady like a ship sailing close to the wind. Aristotle, for his part, already noted that some in his time were of the opinion that the best constitution is the one that is a mix. Actually, he says mix, literally, but I'll say a mix of all the constitutions. And they praise the Spartan constitution because it is made up of oligarchy, monarchy, and democracy. The kingship forming the monarchy, and the council of elders the oligarchy, while the democratic element is represented by the ephors. But the ephors are selected by the people. Though Aristotle quickly adds that others declare the effort to be a tyranny and find the element of democracy in the Spartans' common meals and habits of daily life. Others still would prefer to locate the democratic element primarily in the citizens' assembly, but whatever precise institutions were accorded to whichever of the three classical regime types, Sparta would be, from this point on, one of the chief exemplars of the theory of the mixed constitution. Aristotle, in fact, uses that phrase, memegmene politeia, at the beginning of the passage that I've just quoted. So Sparta entered into the tradition of the balanced and mixed constitution, which would be taken on by the peripatetic Dicaearchus of Messene and Cicero before being revived in Renaissance Florence and again in 18th century France and America. But how closely does the theoretician's model of the mixed constitution fit onto the historical realities of the Spartan constitution? Are there ways in which viewing the Spartan constitutional order through this lens, especially through a modern lens, might distort our view of things? Are there no differences in emphasis, at least, between the mixed constitution that Madison and his fellow founding fathers saw in Sparta and the one that they built in America? And what might this tell us about possible futures for the idea of a mixed constitution? All of these are questions I'll try and touch on very briefly in this contribution. So let's begin with the first and the most historical question. To what extent was Sparta really a mixed constitution? Now, there is, of course, no denying that there were different elements in Sparta's constitution. There's no denying that some of them have a better claim to reflect one of the classical regime types than do the others. The Spartan kings, for example, are clearly more in the monarchical direction than the assembly. Even if there were, it's worth remembering, 2 Spartan kings, as we were reminded in the last talk. And there's no denying, finally, that many of the elements of this constitution counteracted one another, with the efforts, for example, keeping watch over the kings in particular. This is something that Polybius, just after the passage I quoted above, is keen to emphasize, that a key feature of the Spartan constitution was, to borrow another idea beloved of the American founders, its checks and balances. In an important 2017 paper, Alberto Essu provided an up-to-date defense of the idea that Sparta should indeed be viewed as a constitution of at least checks, balances, and veto points, or at least a constitution of divided powers, in which a number of different institutions shared some authority. Essu's careful analysis emphasizes 2 things in particular. First, that the Spartan system featured strict probulusis. In other words, proposals could not simply be made by citizens in the assembly, but had to come before the assembly deliberated from another source, either the elders or the ephors. The term probulusis, as I'm sure most of you know, means something like pre-deliberation. The second process that Essu emphasized is nomophulakia, that is, guardianship of the laws, literally. In his reading of what he regards as the crucial evidence, the Spartan Council of Elders had the power, by a majority vote, to overturn even proposals that had just been passed in the assembly. Essu's paper is an important one, and many of the pieces of evidence he draws on undoubtedly deserve our attention. At the same time, we might want to note that, as he admits, the term probulusis and nomophulakia don't seem to have seen much use in classical Sparta. There's also the fact that the 2 items of evidence he leans on most heavily are both from quite late sources, coming as they do from the 1st century BC historian Diodorus Siculus and from Plutarch's life Agis, which is probably written in the early 2nd century AD. Granted, of course, both of these writers seem to have been following earlier sources, Ephorus and Philarchus, respectively, who were writing closer to the time of the events they describe with the passages cited by Essu. All the same, Plutarch especially had his own agendas beyond simple historical accuracy, and we would always do well to recall the advice of the American historian Chester Starn, an article written almost 60 years ago now, to treat much later writing about archaic Sparta, classical Sparta, and especially about the Constitution, with some skepticism, as I'm sure we all do. Even if we give these passages the benefit of the doubt, though, the picture they give us of Spartan decision-making is hardly a clear one, as Essu admits. As Essu admits, other discussions of the same passages come to different conclusions, with many presenting the relevant procedures as rather messier and less formal than modern constitutional historians might like. The passage from Diodorus, at any rate, this is on your handout, says that in 475/4 BC, both the Council of Elders and the Assembly were summoned to discuss declaring war on Athens. The Assembly was in favor of war, but then Heteromaridas, one of the elders, persuaded both his fellow elders and the Assembly to change their minds. In the passage from Plutarch, the Ephor Lysander proposes a reform bill to the Council of Elders on behalf of King Agis IV, this in 243/2 BC, but they are split on the motion. Lysander then summons an assembly, which passes the motion after a debate in which Agis himself argues in favor of it. Later, though, the Council of Elders vetoes the motion by a majority vote in Essu's reading. So Essu concludes from this that unless the Council of Elders unanimously pre-approved the motion, they could later overturn a bill, even if it had been passed by a majority vote in the Assembly. The conclusion, it seems to me, is really only necessary in the passage from Plutarch, which deals with a decision taken deep into Hellenistic times. Essu also draws support from a rider or amendment that Plutarch says was added to the Great Retro. Base of it, of course, an early constitutional document, a rider which states that if the people make a crooked or scolios decision, kings and the elders are to be apostateras, that is, literally setters aside. That seems to heavily qualify, if it does not completely contradict the declaration in the main text of the Retro, that the people are to have the deciding voice and the power. Damo detan kurian emen kai kratos. It would also more relevantly here cohere nicely with Essu's suggestion that the Council of Elders could overturn decisions of the Assembly by popular vote. But there are plenty of reasons to doubt that the rider to the Retro was enforced in classical times. And I have myself always been partial to the views of Ogden and Van Wees, who have argued that the language of the writer is older than the main text of Petra, and that the writer might better be seen as a constitutional adage, to use Ogden's term, oligarchic in spirit and archaic in its wording, that we have other examples of in Diodorus. If this adage was later replaced with the more republican main text of the writer, that would also align the development of Sparta's constitution more closely with what we know of the development of most other Greek city-states in the late Archaic period, with more republican constitutional reforms superseding a more aristocratic order. I can add some further points about Essu's excellent paper. For example, if the passages that he discusses suggest that the Council of Elders could play an important and perhaps even decisive role, they also show that it was important for elders and ephors to make proposals and arguments in the assembly. And they show the centrality of the assembly in any plausible sequence of decision-making institutions. Of course, if the assembly was powerless, or virtually so, we might ask why the elders bothered putting motions to the assembly at all, and then, if Essu is right, voting on them again, rather than just making decisions directly in the Council of Elders. I could also stress the importance of the ephors, who, as Essu reminds us, also played a role in introducing motions to the Spartan assembly, and who we must see as a popular element in the Spartan constitution against Aristotle, even if their mode of appointment election was more commonly seen in oligarchic terms in the ancient Greek world than in democratic terms the way we see it today. Since, as Westlake showed in the 1970s, you couldn't hold the office of ephor more than once, a significant minority of Spartan citizens, perhaps 5 or 6%, would have served as an ephor at some point in their lives. No wonder Aristotle, in his Politics, calls them oitukrantes, that is, as we might say today, randoms, or just random men. He also stresses that they were elected ek demu pantos, or from the whole mass of the people. And there's no getting around the ephors' power, nor their centrality to the Spartan constitutional order. The formula for enacting a law at Sparta was apparently edoxe tois rois kai te ecclesia. That is, the ephors and the assembly decided, not the council and the people decided, as in Athens. I could make these and similar points at more length, but I've probably already made clear that I incline more to the side of those scholars like Hodgkinson and Rafflaub and Wallace, who Essu mentions as viewing Sparta in more democratic terms. Of course, nobody would go so far as to claim that Sparta was a democratia in ancient Greek terms. Aristotle does say that the increasing influence of the ephors and the decadence of the Western system in his time had made Sparta from an aristocratia to a democratia. And Simon Hornblower has written that, quote, the history of European democracy begins arguably, ... in Sparta. But it may be wise to follow another tendency in Hodgkinson's scholarship and avoid the temptation to see Sparta as unique, rather than sharing a spectrum on constitutional as on other matters with other Greek city-states. Essu himself says that the divided powers he sees in the Spartan system is also a feature of the democratia, and Professor Harris made the same point in his lecture. And I would agree with him both that the Spartan system distributed power and that it is not completely without similarities to democratic Athens. At the same time, I still wonder whether seeing Sparta as the first example of a mixed constitution is quite correct. Perhaps it will become clear why I think this if we briefly compare Sparta with the US Constitution, which, as we have seen, was designed more or less along mixed constitution lines. Such, at any rate, is clear from the final product. Even if direct references to the Spartan Constitution, as opposed to Montesquieu or Polybius, are not very common in the Federalist paper. I was surprised how few I could find, actually. Federalist 38 brings in Lycurgus as part of its argument that constitutions are best designed not by an assembly of men, but by some individual citizen of preeminent wisdom and improved integrity, or perhaps a small group of them, like the American Founding Fathers. Federalist 6 lists Sparta alongside Athens, Rome, and Carthage as a republic, and hence a possible model for the project being undertaken by Madison, Hamilton, and their associates, which was, after all, to create a new, united, and perhaps above all, non-monarchical state from what had been the larger part of British North America. Soon, though, we see that if the absence of a monarch was a starting assumption, the main lesson that Hamilton and Madison drew from Sparta wasn't that kings or presidents might need to be restrained, but that the popular element in their constitution might. As Madison tells his readers in Federalist 63, Sparta's ephory, as he calls them, eventually drew all power into their own hands, and they are thus, with the Roman tribunes for Madison, an example of the irresistible force possessed by that branch of free government, which has the people on its side. Here already we have a difference in emphasis between the Spartan and the US constitutions. Obviously, both the Spartan and the US constitutions have provisions to keep both the monarchical and the popular elements of their constitutions in check. But in Sparta, the ephor's supervision of the kings may have included the ability to fine, suspend, and even imprison them, seems to have been rather tighter than anybody's supervision of the assembly, even if Essie was right about the elders' ability to overturn popular votes. The US Constitution, for its part, does of course include a provision for the impeachment of sitting presidents, together with various other checks and balances on the executive. Until 1804, these actually included could include the vice president, who was originally the second place finisher in the presidential election. And yet anyone who has read Hamilton's strenuous efforts in Federalists 48 to 57 to defend the idea of a vigorous executive branch is made acutely aware that it wasn't the idea of a constrained presidency that the framers of the US Constitution had to argue for to their fellow revolutionaries, but the idea of any office that stood in for kings rather than simply doing away with kings. Madison's reading of ancient history convinced him that, as he wrote in Federalist 10, pure democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Some occasions, Madison seemed to think that the turbulence of direct democracy was mainly a result of its very numerous assemblies, in which, as he put it in Federalist 55, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. It was this anxiety about mass assemblies that led Madison to muse that had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. The sheer size and scale of even colonial or immediately post-colonial America was enough to ensure that the House of Representatives of the new United States would not be an assembly open to any citizen who cared to show up on the model of the Athenian ecclesia. But it also helped further a constitutional tendency that was central to the way that Madison thought about the mixed constitution, and that would play a central role in his new constitution for the United States. This was a tendency for America's new institutions to abstract away from the citizens themselves, to keep them at a distance, and to make sure that the citizens' own participation was mediated, so to speak, through elected or even appointed representatives. Representative institutions could serve, as Madison assured the readers of Federalist 10, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. As a result, through such institutions, it might well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for the purpose. Institutions that served to filter the public views in this way included the Senate, which was from 1789 to 1913 filled with senators appointed by state legislatures, and of course the Electoral College, which still today forms a kind of middleman or set of middlemen between American voters and the selection of their president. There are some obvious, but I think important ways in which the Spartan mode of governance was different. For a start, as in all ancient Greek assemblies, Sparta's citizens attended the assembly themselves, rather than having representatives attend for them, as in the U.S. House of Representatives, or appoint representatives to attend for them, as in the early U.S. Senate. The 5 ephors were elected annually, not every 6 years like a U.S. senator, and unlike a U.S. representative, that is sitting in the House of Representatives, ephors were almost certainly, as we've seen, restricted to a single term. There was not then much of an effort made in Sparta to filter or refine the citizenry or the citizens' views, or to set up institutions at considerable removes from the citizens themselves. If other institutions, such as the Council of Elders, did serve to qualify the rhetoric's pronouncement that the damos, that is the citizenry, would have sovereignty and power, this was not because of any fear of citizen mobs, either in the assembly or elsewhere, not of any fear of citizen mobs, either in the assembly or elsewhere. There was, of course, a perpetual fear of mobs at Sparta, but the mobs that disturbed the sleep of conservative Spartiates were not citizens. They were made up instead of all those groups that were below the citizen Spartiates in status: the Neodamodes, or freedmen, Hypomaiones, devoted ex-citizens, the Perioikoi, men from other towns in the territory that Sparta dominated. Above all, though, the Spartiates' nightmare mobs were made up of Messenian helots, the serfs, really slaves, as David Lewis has shown, Professor Harris was talking about in his talk, the slaves that the Spartiates had conquered in archaic times and who they had ruthlessly dominated ever since. And it was for good reason that the Spartans feared these groups. Rebellions like that of Kinedon in 399 BC, which united all the groups we just mentioned, did sporadically erupt. And it would be the Theban general Epaminondas' liberation of the Messenian Helots after the Battle of Boyctra in 371 that finally put paid to Sparta's status as a major classical power. The citizen class, though, was different. As long as citizens paid the amount of grain that was sufficient to ensure their continuing membership in a mess hall or sycition, they were part of the club. That club was conceived of as a club of equals, or homoioi, and the fact that the Spartiates were no more completely equal than the members of any other society need not blind us to the importance of this ideological conception of themselves. Not for nothing did Sam Adams, one of the so-called anti-federalists who opposed Madison's Constitution of the United States, not for nothing did Sam Adams view Sparta as a model not for the mixed constitution, but for a kind of communitarianism that a new American state could emulate, according to him, in building a Christian Sparta. The Spartan constitution may have involved different institutions, but these were arguably more oriented towards manifesting and expressing the sovereignty of Spartiate citizens than they were towards abstracting away from, guarding against it. Esser, to repeat the point, is right that the Spartan constitution is one that divided power, and he's right also that in this it can be compared to the Athenian constitution. Esser was also right, of course, that Sparta was what the Greeks, after a certain point, called an oligarchia. Sparta was an oligarchy partly because of the political institutions it had, not least an elected council of elders, men over 60 years of age, rather than a council of 500 allotted citizens on the Athenian model. But it was also an oligarchy because of the way it defined citizenry, in a significantly more restricted way than Athens did. In Athens, any man, both of whose parents were native Athenians, could be a citizen, however poor he might have to be. He could participate in politics. This was a key feature of Athens' democracy, one that Socrates in Plato's Protagoras remarks upon when he asks why the Athenians let just any man speak in the assembly, including such riffraff as carpenters, blacksmiths, and even shoemakers. The Athenian orator Aeschines, in one of his speeches, tells a story that does involve two ordinary citizens speaking in the Spartan assembly, and it seems likely that ordinary Spartans could speak in the assembly, even if they couldn't make proposals, though I don't think even that is entirely clear. More important, though, is the fact that a significant subset of native and freeborn males were completely barred from the assembly and other central political institutions at Sparta. There were, of course, poorer Spartans, or those who couldn't afford to pay their mess bills. These were, of course, the people who were excluded were poorer Spartans. In Athens, the Macedonian Antipater's imposition of a property requirement for political participation in 321 BC has widely been seen as marking the end of the classical Athenian democracy. In Sparta, the disenfranchisement of poor men was simply one of the design features of its classical constitution. Now, these days, in our modern representative democracies, or what we call democracies these days, everyone is a citizen. Well, not exactly everyone, but citizenship has been extended beyond what the vast majority of Spartiates and even Athenian citizens would have agreed with, or at least felt comfortable proposing. The idea of the mixed constitution has played a key role in creating modern constitutions that have vastly increased the participation of ordinary people, initially ordinary men, in government, even while also putting powerful protections in place for the various freedoms, chief among them, of course, the freedom of speech, without which democracy cannot flourish. And yet I think we would go wrong in concluding the main lesson we have to draw from Sparta, let alone Athens, is the importance of the mixed constitution, the separation of powers, and of constitutional checks and balances. This would be to draw, now almost 250 years after the American Revolution, virtually the exact same conclusions that Hamilton and Madison drew. And without wishing to underestimate two of the great constitutional theorists and practitioners of Western history, that would seem somewhat curious. After all, Madison and Hamilton were working without the benefit of 19th and 20th century, 21st century classical scholarship, epigraphy, and archaeology. Above all, they were writing before the Great Revolution and literate perceptions of Athenian democracy that was chiefly affected by the English banker and politician George Grote. If Madison and Hamilton had been able to read Grote or something like him, Grote might at least have balanced out the often rather democracy-skeptical insinuations of many of the ancient sources. As a result, the American founding fathers might have had a less negative view of Athenian democracy and of democracy in general. But an approach to Sparta, less dominated by Plutarch and Polybius, not to mention Montesquieu, might also have given them different ideas about the relative importance of the mixed constitution, the separation of powers, and citizen sovereignty. In a 2010 essay, the great Danish scholar of Athenian democracy, Hermann Hansen, argued that despite what we may think, we do not really have a separation of powers in our democracy, even in the United States. For Hansen, Madison's obsession with checks and balances ultimately led to the supposedly separate legislative, executive, and judicial powers being inextricably entangled. Hansen suggested that we would be better off abandoning the whole idea of a separation of powers and identify more with the theory of the mixed constitution, an idea that is, according to Hansen, already a better fit for our polities, what with their mix, for the most part, of congresses and parliaments, senates and houses of lords, and monarchs or quasi-monarchical presidents. The mixed constitution was, as we've seen, something that the US founding fathers had in mind in designing their constitution. But it's not an obvious fit for the British Constitution or the constitutions that derive more directly from it, such as the constitutions of Canada and New Zealand. Even if these constitutions' literally monarchical element might make them seem a better fit initially, and even though many of these constitutions have moved in recent years to embrace a more American-style separation of powers, the still newish Supreme Court's replacement of the law lords as the highest court of appeal in the UK is probably the most obvious example of that trend. At the heart of these systems, though, the Commonwealth systems, is not really any notion of mixing or balance, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. That's the case if, even if formally, the sovereign is the crown in Parliament. These days, the crown element there is not much more than a formality. Whole bookcases of books have been written on how this principle of parliamentary sovereignty has won out over rival institutions in Britain in the century since the Civil Wars. However, it was arrived at, though, it seems clear that by the 20th century at least, parliamentary sovereignty was gaining ground, partly because it could appeal to what has now become the only real source of legitimacy in governance, the people. Even in the US, Madison's mixed constitution has over time become less Republican and more Democratic, small r and small d, even as more and more Americans have started to identify themselves and their government with democracy. US senators began being directly elected by citizens in 1913, and even in the electoral college, electors have long been overwhelmingly pledged, as they call it, that is, voting according to the popular will in their state, rather than their own precepts, which obviously consigns to the dustbin, rightly so in my view, any idea of the electoral college functioning as a filtration mechanism for the views of the masses. Another idea that modern Democrats might want to consign to the historical dustbin, or at least as a normative ideal, is the classical idea of mixed constitution. The problem with the idea as a philosophical gambit has always been that it offers a kind of false compromise. To the Democrat who argues that all those affected by decisions should share in decision-making power, the theorist of the mixed constitution says, but what about the rule of the few and the rule of the one, as well as the rule of the many? But the Democrat has no real need to respect these alternatives, especially when, as often, no real normative argument has been advanced in defense of them. Ancient authors like Polybius sometimes argued, as we've seen, that the mixed constitution was necessary to stabilize things and put the ruinous cycle of constitutions to a halt. But modern research has hardly borne out Polybius's vision of this cycle empirically, let alone the sequences of constitutions offered by Plato or Aristotle. Indeed, the statistical study of world democracies carried out by Jaworski and his collaborators concluded that democracies, especially wealthy democracies, are outstandingly stable, and so should hardly be in need of much stabilizing from less stable regime types. Is there any way of repurposing the idea of a mixed constitution for our more democratic age? Not, as I have suggested, if the idea is to mix the rule of the many, the rule of the few, and the rule of the one. But other types of mixing may well be helpful. If the public is the sole true source of legitimacy, and we want our states to be ruled by the people, there still remains the problem of how we tell what the people want, or how to allow the people, and truly the people, to rule. From this perspective, different forms of democratic institutions might be seen as different ways of sampling the population. Political scientists and social choice theorists of a right libertarian persuasion like William Riker, have long argued that every voting system has serious drawbacks. None perfectly fulfills all the criteria we might want to include in what counts as letting people choose. If this is the case, though, there's another alternative to the extreme skepticism of democracy advocated by the likes of Riker. This is to craft democratic systems that include a mixture of ways of sampling or involving the people. First past the post might be used in a lower house, form of proportional representation for an upper house, and sortition might find a new life in choosing local officials or magistrates with a more ceremonial role. At this point, I am myself indulging in a little of the utopian ideal political theory that Plato was apparently so fond of. I'm acutely aware that you may find my schemes no more tempting than his. So let me return in closing to the earth and to Sparta. The idea of the mixed constitution is, I would submit, really an oligarchic one that was favored by thinkers from Aristotle through to Madison, who had some time for democracy, but not all that much. It was also, I would suggest, always something of a theoretical imposition on the society as it took to be its best representatives. I hope that Alberto Essu would agree that if his article makes clearer how Sparta was more constitutionally conservative than Athens, it wasn't intended to argue that the mixed constitution is a perfect description of the classical Spartan regime. I hope he would also agree that his article also makes clearer the ways in which Sparta and Athens were quite comparable. And here he would stress the division or dispersal of power across several institutions. And I would stress that both states were oriented ultimately not around an attempt to abstract away from citizens, but around the idea of citizen sovereignty. If that is true, classical Sparta might join Athens in having something to teach us, not so much about how we can restrain the masses, as has often been thought, but about how citizens with the right mixture of institutions can rule and empower themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. That was wonderful to have you finally with us. Edward.
Dear James, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yep.
Yeah, great. That was a great paper. Greetings from the other side of the world. And thank you so much. We're so happy that we were able to straighten out the problems with this to get your wonderful paper. I couldn't agree with you more on many, many things. And I also really admire your knowledge, not only, of course, of the ancient world, but also your excellent knowledge, again, of political theory, again, in the 18th century, and also on recent works. And that really is a wonderful contribution, again, to the discussion. I generally agree with your basic idea that we have to be very careful about taking analogies from the past. I couldn't agree with you more, that we have to be very careful. I just want to put a slightly, again, it's furthering kind of your analysis, is there's a difference between the way the ancients divided up government and and the way the moderns divide up government. Now, as you rightly said, because of Montesquieu, but to a certain extent, Montesquieu is describing what he sees, is there's a distinction between the executive, legislative, and the judicial. The distinction, though, in ancient Greece is slightly different. It's between a deliberative function, a judicial function, and the magistrates. And this is made clear in the organization of Aristotle's discussion of the politics, but it's also implicit in the organization of the section chapters 42 to the end of the Aristotelian Ath Paul, as Moens Hansen has pointed out, and I must say I fully agree with Moens there. So in other words, when we're talking about mixtures, they're mixing in a different way. And this is where I think, this is in support of your point, where we need to be really careful about the context if we're going to draw analogies. And I think in that sense, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that when the ancients are mixing, they tend to mix in a different way, therefore. And the reason they do tend to mix in two ways between aristocracy and democracy, and one is in the deliberative function. And a lot of it has to do with the mix between the powers of the council and the powers of the assembly. In Athens, the powers of the assembly are very, very strong. In Sparta, the council is much stronger. And we even get variations, for instance, in different places, again, Alberto Esa will be showing kind of at councils. So that is a difference. And this idea of having, because they divide up government differently. The other way in which they mix is also in the magistrates, between the election and the sortition. And as Aristotle says, sortition is more democratic, and again, election is more aristocratic. So if you're going to mix, you're going to have a mix kind of between the two, which doesn't really translate, I think, into the modern system. So at any rate, that's very much, I think, some points kind of in support kind of your excellent paper. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Edward. I agree with what you said. I mean, you were agreeing with me, but yeah, so the division in the ancient cities between deliberative, judicial, and then you have magistrates, basically, officials. Yeah, so in those cases, I mean, if you read about the Athenian officials, they're meant to be something like 700 domestic officials and 700 officials abroad, you know, and Henson said that that's broadly right. So is that the executive? I mean, if you try and map on this modern distinction between legislative, judicial, and executive, you'd have to say to the magistrates and the executive. Does that work? Well, sometimes it does, right? So like the generals are pretty executive, they go out and do things, but they're elected. And then the vast majority of the magistrates at Athens, something like 600 out of the 700, they're sortative. And a lot of them aren't really doing things that we would describe as executive in any way. I mean, they're dealing with finances and they're dealing with drain. Well, people dealing with the drains are elected too, but you know, they're dealing with various sort of duties that aren't really obviously executive. So then with Sparta, I mean, it's difficult because, you know, the kings are the obvious go-to for executive. And the last paper actually kind of made me, I couldn't hear it all that well, but it seemed to be arguing that kings actually are quite different from the rest, and maybe they do play a separate role. My temptation was always to sort of see them as, well, like the Archon Basileus in Athens is sort of looking further along the path that the Spartan kings might have eventually gotten to or something. But so maybe there's a bit more to be said for the Spartan kings as executive. But even that doesn't quite fit. I mean, it's definitely not this explicit thing. Like if you read Hamilton on the presidency, he really wants it to be a strong, vigorous executive. I don't think we know that that's the case for Sparta. The kings have these ceremonial roles. It's just all a bit messier. When they're on campaign, maybe they're executive, but otherwise they seem to be on quite a tight rope, and the efforts are following them around. So yeah, I agree. It doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite map on.
No, I agree. It is very difficult to map those modern categories onto the ancient categories. I couldn't agree with you more. Thanks a lot.
I think we probably have time for one more question, if there is one. A brief one. Yeah, do you want to?
Hi, James. It's Alberto here. Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Thank you for your critical engagement with my article. And I would like just to make a question to you and a comment. I will start with a comment about which actually ties with what Edward just said and the discussion you had about modern categories. I agree with you about the separation of powers. This is why in the article and in general in my study of this concept, I've never used the word separation of powers, because I don't think if we use the classical distinction, of course, that is enshrined in the Constitution of the United States, at least the original one, and of course formulated by Montesquieu, does not apply. This is why I use the singular divided power, which was a way to get out in using modern legal theory from the famous discussion that started in Athenian debate, not in Spartan debate, is about the locus of sovereignty, where should we put the sovereignty? And the idea is that in Sparta, as much as in Athens, in this I agree with you, the two are comparable, the power of basically enacting binding norms that bind the entire citizenry was divided, rather than the classical division of powers in which you have the judiciary and the magistrates and the legislative divided in that way. This is something I wanted to specify because conceptually they are different, divided power and separation of powers. The second, when you talk about whether we should use the model of mixed constitution, I was wondering which model of mixed constitution did you adopt in the paper? Because of course, if we go through the Aristotelian one, the one that he describes, especially in book 4 of the Politics, that's an eminently sociological one, where institutions, for example, have very little per se, according to Aristotle, very little role. And I wonder if you think that Sparta had that type of mixed constitution, or, for example, the model that Plato had more in mind in the laws. Thank you.
Yeah, the last one's a really difficult question. I need to sort of study that more. I mean, I at least caught myself and said, you read some of the earlier instances of the mixed constitution when people write genealogies of it, like in Thucydides, you actually only have a mixing of 2 rather than 3. Like when Thucydides talks about there was a moderate mixing in the regime of the 5,000 of the few and the many. So there are these different models, and of course Aristotle's more sociological. I mean, I suppose I think I could probably base this more around my comparison between the US and Sparta, because I was really thinking my go-to was really Madison and Hamilton and the Federalist Papers, and rereading through that. So I think I was kind of projecting that view back and seeing how well it fit more than anything else. But yeah, you're right. I have to distinguish that from sort of ancient ideas of the mixed constitution, because there is this kind of like, I guess it's kind of like a Whiggish tendency to write these histories of the mixed constitution, and you just say, oh yeah, Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle, they were all saying the same thing. It's interesting, Madison has the language of the one, the few, and the many, in the passage I quoted right at the beginning, which seems distinctly odd in a modern context. So there is a link with the Greeks. But anyway, I'll have to think more about that one. As for the rest, yeah, divided power, that's right. I think divided powers might have slipped into my script, but yeah, I take the point. You weren't talking about separation of powers at all in the mixed constitution. Hopefully I made that clear. And I'll just say in closing, actually, I really enjoyed your paper, and I tried to like fight a rearguard action against it, but I think the earlier bit of my paper isn't as strong because I couldn't find it really hard to find good objections. And I was trying to drive this kind of view of Sparta as more popular, more democratic in a soft sense, but I actually found it quite hard to deal with. So, I mean, the stuff that I'm saying about like Plutarch's very late, it's a bit desperate, but I think that at least I think you probably agree with this too. I'm just saying that it's not certain. I mean, nothing is certain in this life or in ancient history, but I guess that's as far as I feel able to go. I don't think I'm able to land any bigger blows than that. So thanks for your paper.
Thank you very much, James. That was a splendid paper, and wonderful to have you all the way from New Zealand. But we now have to move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Selini Psoma from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. She is in particular an expert in numismatics and ancient coinage, but she's also an expert.
παραδοσιακό μέχρι το μοντέρνο στυλ. Κεραμοσκεπές και ξύλινες στέγες. Πρωτότυπες...
The PowerPoint, you need the handout, otherwise you can't follow me. It's a long one. It's something else about. I sent yesterday everything to Chrysanthi, and also now it's what's his name? It's Alberto who will photocopy it. Yeah.
Δυο λόγια γράφω στο χαρτί, μα κόφκω τα φτερά τους, κλειδώνω τα να με φανεί, με λύπη με χαρά τους. Αισθάνθηκε ο ποταμός, θωρεί με μαραζώνει, γεμώνουσιν τα μάτια του και το νερό θολώνει. Ο έρωτας ο γητεύτης, εμπάντα τσίνος νικητής, του κόσμου κυβερνήτης, μαν τυραννός ο χαρισμός, βάρης αβάσταχτος καμός και πέτρο καταλήτης, και πέτρο καταλήτης.
Σε τόπον είσαι μακρινό, το φως μου δε σε βρίσκει.
Μια αγκάλι μου γυρεύκησε κι αγιάτρευτη μην ίσχυ. Ο άνεμος ο Μερακλής χορεύκει μάνιχος του, σε μας χαρίζει τη δροσιά, μα ο πόνος δικός του. Ο έρωτας ο γητεύτης, εμπάντα τσίνος νικητής, του κόσμου κυβερνήτης, μαν τυραννός ο χαρισμός, βάρης αβάσταχτος καμός και πέτρο καταλήτης, και πέτρο
Όμορφη πόλη, φωνές μουσικές, απέραντι δρόμοι, κλεμμένες ματιές. Ο ήλιος χρυσίζει, χέρια σπαρμένα, βουνά και για πια πελάγια πλωμένα. Θα γίνεις δικιά μου πριν έρθει η νύχτα. Τα χλωμάτα φώτα πριν ρίξουν δίχτυα. Θα γίνεις δικιά μου. τα παράθυρα κλείσαν, η νύχτα έπεσε, οι δρόμοι χαθήκαν.
Τα μάτια σου τα μαθήτα, στα αλήθινα τζαλαθήτα, ότι θωρούν πενευκούντο, γελιούνται και πιστεύκούντο. Τα ψέματα που ξέρουσι να πούσιν την αλήθεια, γλυκιά να συναφέρουσι τα πιο πικρά στολίδια. Έμαθα κι αγαπώ τα, σαν τα φιλιά τα πρώτα. Τα λόγια που μαγευκούσι, που τα μισά κλειδώνουν τα και τα άλλα φανερώνουν τα. Τα ψέματα που ξέρουσι να πούσιν την αλήθεια, γλυκιά να συναφέρουσι τα πιο πικρά στολίδια. Έμαθα κι αγαπώ τα, σαν τα φιλιά τα πρώτα.
Of Thucydides description of the days and deeds of the Spartan Brasidas in the Chalcidic Peninsula. The Chalcidians of Thrace, together with others, revolted from Athens in 432, and they were the only exiles of Athens who were never obliged to come back to the Athenian so-called alliance with all known consequences. For that, they had the support of the nobles of all Spartans, Brasidas. Brasidas, who was a man of virtue, a philanthropos, a great general, not the sort of Spartan that we have in the late 5th century, early 4th century BC with Lysander. Now, one of the main pieces of evidence for the view that Sparta was an example of cruelty and oppression is the tradition about the Crypteia. Two passages, one from Heraclides Lembos and another from Plutarch, describe the Crypteia as helot hunting by young Spartans. Since the 18th century, specialists of Sparta, of education, initiation rites, and of religion examined this institution and have offered different explanations for what seems to be a Spartan peculiarity: initiation rite, secret police, survival training. Anthropologists propose to explain it as an initiation rite, while others stressed the military character. One can find the history of debate and relevant research in recent works published by Jean-Christophe Couven, Massimo Nafisi, and Marcus Handy. The aim of my paper today is to offer a fresh look on old and new evidence about the crypteia and the cryptoi and combine it with what we learn about cryptoi in Attica from Attic inscriptions. Let's turn first to the evidence we have. Now, evidence for the crypteia derived from Plato's laws and a scholion on the passage. In the laws, the Spartan Megillus states that there is also something called crypteia, which is an extraordinary harsh form of training in winter, neither food cheer nor bedding, no slaves, so that each one looks after himself, and wandering all over the territory night and day. This is not the only information one finds about Spartan institutions in the laws of Plato. At 691 of the Politeia, the work of the Legis, accurately describes the main political institutions of Sparta: the double kingship, the council of 28 elders, and the ephors. In another passage, the work states that the city of Sparta has no walls. And in the last book, there is an allusion to xenilasia, the practice of driving out foreigners. Bon. All this information is well confirmed by other sources for the classical period. In other words, the laws is a reliable source for Spartan institutions. There is evidence, there is therefore no reason to doubt the description of the crypteia, which was ignored by scholars for decades. From the scholion on the passage, which most probably dates from the 9th century AD and goes back to the commentary of Proclus, we learn that a young man would be sent out of the city with orders to avoid detection for a certain length of time. He was therefore forced to live wandering the mountains, sleeping with one eye open so as not to be caught, and without being able to use slaves or carry provisions. This was also a form of training for war, since each young man was sent out naked, having been ordered to spend an entire year wandering outside the city up in the mountains and to keep himself alive by stealing and other shifts of that kind, and do it in such a way as to avoid being seen by anybody. This is why it was called the crypteia, because those who had been seen, wherever that might occur, would be punished. The new elements are the mountain, the duration of a year, and the need to be careful also while resting. This evidence is also found in a passage from the Epitome of the Philippica of Pompeius Trogus by Justin. The Lucanians were accustomed to raise their children with the same kind of education as the Spartans, for from their earliest boyhood they were kept in the wilds among the shepherds, without any slaves to attend them, and even without clothes to wear or to sleep upon, that from the first years they might be accustomed to hardiness and spare diet, having no intercourse with the city. Their food was what they took in hunting, and their drink milk of water. Thus they were prepared for the toils of war. The main points can be summarized as follows. The crypteia was to train young Spartans in endurance, while there is no mention of weapons or policing. This fragment extends the period of training for a longer time, but the basic details are similar to those found in Plato. Another passage, this time Plutarch, Life of Lycurgus, brings some more evidence. Now, Plutarch mentions both Plato and Aristotle. You have to read the passage or hear what I'm saying because it comes from different translations. Now, in all this, there is no trace of injustice or arrogance, which some attribute to the laws of Lycurgus, declaring them efficacious in producing valor, but defective in producing righteousness. The so-called crypteia, or secret service of the Spartan, if this he really one of the institutions of Lycurgus, as Aristotle says it was, may have given Plato also this opinion of the man and his civil policy. This secret service was of the following nature. The magistrates from time to time sent out into the country at large the most discreet of the young warriors, equipped only with daggers and such supplies as were necessary. In the daytime, they scattered into obscure and out-of-the-way places, where they hid themselves and lay quiet. But in the night, they came down into the highways and killed every helot whom they caught. Oftentimes, too, they actually traversed the fields where helots were working and slew the sturdiest and best of them. So, too, Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, there follows a summarized verse account of the massacre of the 2,000 helots in 483 of Thucydides. And he finishes. Aristotle, in particular, says also that the Ephors, as soon as they came into office, made formal declaration of war upon the helots in order that there might be no impiety in slaying them. Aristotle is cited by Plutarch as his source for two things: the institution of the crypteia that goes back to Lycurgus, which Plutarch doubts, and the oath of the Ephors. The information that is derived from Aristotle, in fact, frames the description of the crypteia by Plutarch and what he considers as a parallel case. Thucydides 480 and the presumed mass slaughter of helots in 424, just before the campaign of Brasidas in Thrace. The only source, apart from Plutarch, that offers the same description of the crypteia is Heraclides Lemmos, author of the 2nd century BC, who lived in Alexandria. He was a statesman and negotiated the peace between Ptolemy VI and Antiochus IV in 169 BC. Among Heracles' works is an epitome of the constitutions attributed to Aristotle that gathered information on the history and organization of the Greek city-states. The epitome covers 44 cities and opens with the Constitution of Athens. For the crypteia, Heraclides says, "It is said that he, Lycurgus, also set up the crypteia, whereby, even to this day, men go out of the city to hide by day and by night in arms, and to disperse and slaughter helots as they think necessary." Heraclides began with the attribution of the introduction of the crypteia to Lycurgus, a common point with Plutarch. In both authors, the description of the crypteia follows, and what comes next is the mention of the Ephors, the respectful character of this magistracy, and in Plutarch, the oath that they swear as they enter office, and of course the oath legalizes the slaughter of helots. We therefore have two traditions: Plato, the scholar of Plato and Pompeius Taurus on their one side, and Aristotle, Heraclides, point d'interrogation, Heraclides Lemmos, and Plutarch on the other. When you are going to have your handout, you can see the differences between the two traditions. And this was one of the reasons that I wanted you to have the handout. So, but I am continuing. Several attempts have been made to reconcile the two different traditions. It has been assumed that there was a shift in the nature of the crypteia from a training regime in Plato's day to a helot hunting exercise in Aristotle's day, or that both of these writers preserve incomplete pictures of the same institution. Similarly, the introduction of helot hunting raised questions. It has been assumed that this was a primitive system of initiation which had its origins in Indo-European prehistory. Alternatively, the practice had been interpreted as a reaction to the Helot revolt of 464, or as a development during the period after 369, which applied only to Laconia. Back to Heraclides and Plutarch, the parallels between the passages of Heraclides and the passage of Plutarch about the crypteia are striking. Men go out of the city, sent into the countryside, who hide by day. By day they stayed hidden and rested, and by night slaughter helots as they think necessary. At night, they came down onto the roads and cut the throat of any helot they could lay hands on. Often, too, they would range through the field, killing the strongest and most influential of them. A cryptonde, to disperse by night, dispersed in concealed positions. The second cryptonde, to hide, which precedes the verb used for slaughter, anerousi in Heraclides, created the problem and was corrected finally by Markovich in a cryptonde, meaning diaspironde. Thus, the cryptonde, with the meaning of diaspironde of Heraclides, becomes diaspiromeni in Plutarch. Proof that accurately says the same thing using a synonym and placing what it describes during the day. Although Plutarch does not mention Heraclitus, but the great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and the respectful historian Thucydides, it is obvious that he uses Heraclitus in his epitome as his source. Now, we have seen that Plato and his laws offer a very different account of the Crypteia, and that his information about other Spartan institutions is absolutely reliable. What about Heraclitus and his epitome? Modern scholars who are interested in the Crypteia do not examine the reliability of Heraclitus. If we turn once more to the editor, Marvin Dilts, we read in the introduction, prior to the publication of a papyrus text of Aristotle Athenaeum Politeia in 1891, there was much discussion on the authenticity of these excerpts. For instance, Köhler, Desvert, Müller, Rose, and Schrader denied that this excerpta Politiarum derived directly from Aristotle's Politeia and suggested Ephorus or other writings of Heraclitus as the sole source of excerpta. You have the bibliography in your handout. For this passage, the editor of Heraclitus, again, refers to Karl von Holzinger, an eminent Austrian philologist, author of a long and rich article on the extracts from the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians and the Cretans. For Holzinger, who followed Schneiderwin, the first editor of Heraclitus, it is Plutarch's description of Crypteia which agrees with that of Heraclitus and provides the proof, die Sicherheit, that the source of Heraclitus was Aristotle. Now, Schneiderwin stated that Aristotle is the source for all these, and his conclusions have been confirmed by the discovery of the Athenaeum Politeia, which seems to have been the first constitution in Aristotle's Politeia. This view was challenged by Polito, who considers this excerpta Politiarum as a series of short excerpta taken from an anonymous compiler without caring particularly about the incoherence of the whole. And since the work of Heraclitus was an epitome of the Aristoteles Athenaeum Politeia, we possess an epitome of an epitome. Now, the only reason that this Heraclitus and his epitome is considered a reliable source is because is the section of the Athenaeum Politeia that he reproduced. Heraclitus, in fact, preserved the order of Aristotle's original text, but showed absolutely no interest in the changes, the metavole, Aristotle's main argument. We need now to turn to the rest of the epitome. Heraclitus' editor, Dilts, considers him a careless excerptor. He stresses that he failed to make a distinction between the two Aristotelian works he accepted, and he did not choose the most significant information. In fragment 5, he confuses Ephialtes and Cimon, and says that Ephialtes made his own land available to those who wished to harvest it, and that with this he gave dinners to many persons. This indicates that even when Heraclitus is reporting information from Aristotle, he cannot be trusted to report this information accurately. In fragment 3, he says that Solon went to live in Egypt when some gave him trouble about his laws. This resembles what we know about Solon, not wishing to change his laws and go to Egypt for trade and sightseeing. But once more, he slightly misinterprets the passages. Now, if we move to Cyrene and other cities, fragment 16, what he main interests him, if it's a story that we know by Herodotus about the kings of Cyrene, is that Pheretimi cut off the breasts of the women. If we move now to Corinth, numbers 19 and 20 of the fragmenta, sorry, I have to go back. How can I go back? I can't. Oh, anyway, sorry. Periander now, Corinth. He gives information for Corinth, and he gives also the old information. We know a lot of things about Bacchus and about Periander from Herodotus. But he says that Periander, he entirely outlawed the possession of slaves and luxuries. But he was moderate in other respects, in not levying a tax on anyone, in being satisfied with the tax on goods from the market and the harbor, and in being neither unjust or overbearing, but hating knavery. He had all prostitutes thrown into the sea. At the last, he established a council which did not allow spending beyond one's income. Herodotus gives us details about all this story, but the story with the prohibition against living in the city is to be found in Diogenes Laertius, who refers to Ephorus and Aristotle. But in the publication of the fragments of Ephorus, the reference is to the Aristotelian Athenian Politia 16 that speaks about Pisistratius and not Periander in his attitude towards poor citizens, and not while the reference to Aristotle is in fact to Heraclitus. Cypselus and Periander appear in Aristotle's Politics, but the only common point between this work and the Epitome is the mention of Periander's bodyguards. The sensational story about throwing the prostitutes into the sea are not in Herodotus, but in Hermippus, the Seven Sages. This was the sort of details that interested Heraclitus. Now, the most gruesome fragment is about a tyrant of Elis, who castrated ambassadors and compelled them to eat their testicles. Now, then, in Cephallenia, we have the son of Peloponnese, who ruled out, and he was cruel, and he himself knew carnally all the virgins before they married. Then comes the famous story of Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas. He put some men into boiling cauldrons and others into crackers of fire. He put still others into a brazen bull and burned them alive. The people punished him, and they also burned his mother and friends. What comes next is the constitution of Tenedos, and this reveals how he is using the evidence he has. The king Tennis established a certain law whereby if one caught on adultery, it was legal to kill him with an axe. And when his own son was apprehended, and when the sculptor asked the king what was to be done, the king replied, obey the law. Therefore, on one side of the coin is engraved an axe, on the other the face of a man and a woman with the same neck. On account of this, it is said concerning severe men to have been cut off by the Tenedian axe. The types now of the coins of Tenedos are Janiform heads, man and woman, and the double axe on the reverse. Both types refer to the eponymous of the island, Tennis, and his sister Imithea, both children of King Kyknos. Their story completely different from what we learned from Fabric 24, and we know the story from another fragment of the Epitome, as well as Conon, Lycophron, Diodorus, Pausanias, and Plato. The story is completely different. And the story about the adultery, told by Heraclitus in this fragment, and reproduced only in later sources, is surely an artificial etion of the coin type and proverb, which belongs to the same genre as if it is not directly adopted from the story of Zalephkos and his son who was convicted under his father's adultery law. Nothing could be better illustrate the methods of Heraclitus and the Epitome, the interest in bloody punishments and the misrepresentation of the figures on the obverse. Now, we move to the constitution of chaos. Old people in chaos, when they became very old, they used to commit suicide, says Heraclitus. No other evidence about this. Perekides of Syros, who consumed by lice and died in Samos, and when Pythagoras came, he extended to him through an opening a finger bare of flesh. Also, if we move to the Samians, the Ogenes, and the short story that he seduced the wife of Euripides, and having made him an accomplice, persuaded the Athenians to send 2,000 men to Samos. They came and exiled everyone. Because the passage mentions 2,000 clerics, it has been proposed to connect it to the history of Samos in the period after the expulsion of Kyprothemis and the Persian garrison by the Athenian general Timotheus during the 5th Prytany of 366-5 BC. Samos had rich agricultural land, and the Athenians therefore took the opportunity to send a clergy. The Athenians also had strategic aims because Samos was too valuable to live in the hands of Mapsolos. It is very improbable that it was the Samian Theogenes who persuaded the Athenians to send the clergy to Samos. It seems also unlikely that all Samians were expelled. Another story now about the constitution of Lycia and the cruel punishment in the constitution of Epizephiri Lefki. Another cruel punishment, this time by weasels in fragment 62 about the Locrians. They say that when he was sleeping one night, weasels attacked him, and in utter despair he killed himself. Now, in the constitution of the Lefkani, they are hospitable and just, and Lamiscus was their king, whose middle two was like that of a wolf. Constitution of the Athamanes. In the land of the Athamanes, the women farm while the men graze cattle. And we are going with the Messenians and the very well-known story of the foundation of Taras. We are happy we have evidence about this from other sources like Antiochus of Syracuse, Aristotle, and Ephoros. And now, almost the pornographic customs of the Thracians. Finally, the stories of the Chalcidians of Thrace, that they left Limnius because of mice, they report, which consumed their possessions and even iron. We have an expression in modern Greek that we say ότι έχει φάει η μύγα ατσάλι. In fragment 70, Ithaka, the god, told Cephalus, when he consulting in the oracle about children, to have sexual intercourse with whomever he should encounter first. He met a bear, and through intercourse with the bear, he begot a woman by whom it is said that Arcesius was appropriately named. Now, the Thespians. It was shameful to learn a trade and to spend time in agriculture. Therefore, the majority of them were poor, and they were deeply in debt to the Thebans, who were thrifty. And, of course, the story of the Archaea Mira. It is shameful for the Lacedaemonians to sell land, and it is not permitted to sell land from the ancient inheritance. It is not a coincidence that this is also what we learn from Plutarch. However, what Aristotle simply says in his Politics is that it was dishonorable to sell property, while he never mentions the Archaea Mira. Stephen Hodkinson, who has analyzed the evidence for land holding in Sparta, has shown that this information is not reliable. This is important because it shows that Plutarch drew on Heraclitus. These are the sort of stories that interested Heraclitus. When given a choice between Plato and the laws as a source for the nature of the Crypteia and the scandal monger Heraclitus, it is to be clear with whom we should trust. There is no reason to assume that all the Heraclitus fragments are derived from Aristotle. In fact, if we are to retain our high opinion of Aristotle and his students, we should hope that most of these fragments are not based on information found in works of his school. To this also points the absence of any mention of Aristotle by the scholar to Plato. Books 4, 5, and 7 of the Politics of Aristotle speak about Sparta, and in this he also mentioned the Helots, but says nothing about the Crypteia, as Velvai. Velvai was a very significant scholar, specialist of slaves, stressed. For Velvai, the verb legete, that Heraclitus used to introduce the description of the Crypteia, clearly shows that what he says about the Crypteia does not go back to Aristotle. He also stressed that although Heraclitus claims that this, the Crypteia, happened also in his days, in his times, whatever we call the Spartan education was abolished by Peloponnese in 888, and it was Nabis in the late 3rd century that almost put an end to Spartan slavery. Now, other evidence contradicting Heraclitus and Plutarch. Most Greek historians ignored the Crypteia. Herodotus offers plenty of information about Sparta, attributed to Lycurgus the common meals and the institution of the Ephors, he says nothing. Critias of the 30s mentioned how difficult life was in Sparta when you were a Helot. The Opembus of Chios stressed how the Helots were bad treated by the Spartans, while Ephoros offered many details on their life. But none of these writers mentioned the Cryptean. Isocrates heavily criticized the Spartans and their methods in his Panegyricos of 380 BC. These are the years of the occupation of the Cadmea. 40 years later, in the Panathinaikos, mentions that Ephors had the power to execute Helots akritos without a trial, which can be seen as a reference to the oath of the Ephors that we have already mentioned. However, Isocrates did not mention the systematic slaughter of the Helots, and there is nothing on the Cryptea in the Hellenica, Agesilaus, and the Lacedaemonian Politia. The fact that Xenophon never mentions the Cryptea is striking, given that he stressed how much the Helots hated the Spartans. They could eat them omon, raw. Now, there are also other authors that accuse Sparta in the years following the foundation of Messini, that also ignore the Cryptea. Alcidamas of Elea, Myron of Priene, and Xenovios, the 2nd century AD author of the Parimian. And our friend Xenophon reveals that while describing the famous conspiracy of Kinavan, that the Ochlos had access to tools for agriculture, carpeting, and quarrying. One wonders how young Spartans would attack Helots who were very well trained by working in the fields day and night and had this sort of arms. Now, other evidence about the Crypteia. The famous passage of Philarchos, who mentions the orders given by the king Cleomenes III to a certain Damotelis, the commander of the Crypteia, before the battle of Selassia, to observe and investigate what was going on at the rear of and around the lines. This was a special mission that this military unit had to execute, and for this, its head, Damoteles, received strict orders from the king himself. We are told the rest of the story that reveals how significant this mission was and how the treachery of Damoteles defeated Cleomenes in the battle of Selassia. And now comes a passage from Plutarch's De Genio Socratis, as it has been masterfully suggested by Denis Knepfler in a recently published paper. Knepfler proposed to read Cryptus instead of Critus in this passage, and the story reports the Theban attack against the Lacedaemonian garrison of the Cadmea in 379 BC. The mission of the Crypti was to watch at night the ways giving access to the citadel. It is to guard that Cadmea during night. In this case, we have a contingent with members who belong most probably to the same group of age, and this strongly recalls what described Philarchus 150, 70 years later. The expression, these were named Crypti, Cryptus legomenus of this passage, and the head of the Cryptea, επί της Crypteas τεταγμένος, present a special interest as they refer to the sort of unit of the Spartan army. Thus, there is evidence that there was at Sparta a military unit named Crypti, and the Spartan Crypti were present not only in Selassia in summer 222, but also in Thebes already in 379 BC. The Spartan Crypti were integrated into the army already in the early 370s BC and probably before. There is also evidence from Athens and Thassos. I will not go into the details of literary sources about both cities, but I will turn to Attic inscriptions. Contingent of Cryptoi, with the commander under the orders of the famous general of the Paralia, is mentioned a number of Attic documents from Ramnus that all date from the 3rd century. The earliest one dates from 268, first year of the Cremonidian War. According to the decree, the Crypti of line 9 had to keep an eye on the countryside and protect the harvest from the Macedonians of Gonatas. The second decree, voted by the Dimote of Rhamnous and the Athenians, residing at Rhamnous, dates from the year Diomedon was archon to 48-7. These are the years of the war against Alexander, son of Craterus. At the date of the decree, the countryside was full of pirates, and the general recruited cryptoi among the soldiers, whom he later sent to positions on the borders of the Syrian zone with the aim of protecting herds and slaves, voskimata και σώματα. The third decree was voted by the cryptoi themselves and dates between 233 and 229. With this decree, the cryptoi voted honors for the general Philotheos, son of Philion, and for others. The crypti operated under, once more, the general of the Paralia and had their own leader. One of their duties was protecting the countryside. They are mentioned in two other decrees from Rhamnous and in an dedication for the general Phoxias, son of Leosthenes. In 3 out of the 5 cases, the crypti are mentioned. The verb kathistame is used to denote the initiative of the generals to appoint crypti. In one of these, it is explicitly mentioned that the crypti were appointed from the existing soldiers. Attic decrees and the passage of Philorpos use the same term to denote the appointment of the ηγεμόν of the cryptia and the crypti. Δαμοτέλης, ο επί της cryptias τεταγμένος, in Philorpos, and η crypti, η τεταγμένη υπό Φιλοθέου, in the Attic decree. The Athenian crypti were both citizens and xeni, as is revealed by the list recording their names, demotics, and in the case they were foreigners, their ethnic. Now, the conclusion. The cryptia can be described as a custom which consisted of sending out of the city at certain times a number of young men to live with a certain length of time under difficult conditions without letting themselves be seen by anyone. Turning now to the details, there are two traditions. The first one, Plato, Hyscholion and Pompeius Toros, and the second one, Heraclides and Plutarch. I tried to show that the reliable evidence for the cryptia is derived from Plato and Hyscholion and is reflected in Trogus. Plutarch relies on Aristotle only for the introduction of the cryptia by Lycurgus and the oath of Ephesus, but for the description, which includes the most problematic Hellenic cutting, he relied neither on Aristotle nor on Plato, but on Heraclides. He borrowed Plato's vocabulary to make the distinction, what Plato didn't do between activities during day and night, reversed Plato's order, and paraphrased Heraclides without citing him. The way Heraclides described the cryptia most probably derives from obscure sources of the sort this Hellenistic scandal monger used for, or the entire story was invented by him. The reliable evidence for the cryptia describes a surveillance training of young Spartans, nay for the Scholion, young men in their 20s, most probably the Yvondes of Xenophon, that strongly recalls similar exercises of all armies from ancient to modern times. In that case, their age fits with their service in the army. This training was on an annual basis and for a short period of time, probably during winter. It seems that a restricted number of young Spartans were selected to participate in this form of training for war. According to the Scholion, the crypti were dispatched in the mountains, most probably those of Laconia, of course, Taigetos and Parma. From Plato and the Scholion, we can deduce that they were supposed to wander without carrying heavy weapons, that is the meaning of gymni, or provisions, and they had neither mattresses nor footgear, and were not accompanied by slaves. Thus, the cryptia can be considered as a surveillance training à la dure, with the aim of incorporating those from the young Spartans who accomplished it successfully into the homonymous military unit. It cannot be excluded that those that participate in the special training were already selected on the basis of their performances, and that this training was on an annual basis or repetitive. As a military unit, the crypti were incorporated into the army already during the Spartan-Olynthian War and the Spartan intervention in Boeotia. We are told that the crypti were charged with a special mission of guarding Cadmea at night. They also played an active role in the army later, since before the Battle of Sellasia, they were ordered to inspect the phalanx. The evidence we have about the mission of this unit at Thebes and Sellasia both point with special character, strongly recalling modern practices. The epigraphic evidence from 3rd century BC Athens reveals that units of this type were to be found also in other cities, either as a response to special needs or under Spartan influence. The earliest evidence comes from the first year of the Chremonidian War, a war during which Athens and Sparta were great allies. Sparta is very well known for its innovative character as far as military is concerned. Plato never mentions a reform of the Cryptia, and I don't believe that there was a reform. One must not attempt to reconcile the two traditions. One is reliable, the other isn't. Although Helots collaborated with Sparta and served as soldiers, being a Helot in this city was not easy, as was being a slave in the ancient Greek world. There is plenty of evidence on this score that has already been cited. The Ephors policed the Helots and had the right to condemn them to death without a trial. But what needs to be taken seriously under consideration is that these Helots were private property of citizens who needed their labor. For this vast area, for Greek standards, that was Sparta and its enormous horror of 8,500 kilometers, 3 times that of Vatican before 369, Helots were the backbone of the economy, what we say in French, la cheville ouvrière. Sparta needed them to cultivate land, work in the quarries and the recently found mining district, or even serve in the army. From this point of view, killing Helots and in large numbers seems inconceivable, and as we have tried to prove, is based on the unreliable evidence of a scandal monger. The use of the cryptor in the Spartan army and corresponding bodies in Attica of the 3rd century further supports the view that the cryptia was a survival technique in adverse conditions and served military needs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating and I think very persuasive and comprehensive demolition of an ancient tradition. That was fantastic. I'm conscious that everyone is probably very hungry, but I know I want to have there might be room for just one quick question as we were delayed. Yes.
Luke.
Thank you so much for this very interesting and stimulating talk on the cryptea. I was hoping if you could expand more on, I guess, Hellenistic laconism or cultural laconism in Athens. Hellenistic laconism in Athens. Olga Paglia has reminded me multiple times of Phocion's interest in Sparta, and this is reflected in Plutarch. The Ramnus inscriptions you just pointed out also show sort of a Hellenistic imitation maybe of established Spartan institutions. Do we see this? Do you have more evidence of this sort of thing in the Hellenistic period that we can point to?
No, what I said, the earliest document comes from the earliest document, that's what I said at the very end, comes from 268, 267. This is the first year of the Chremonidian War. We know that they were allies. They were allies, they were paid by the Ptolemies to create problems to the Macedonians. So it could be, these two cities come closer after 369 BC. They have, Sparta wants Messenia, Athens wants back Amphipolis. If you want my opinion, Sparta is more right in trying to get back Messenia than Athens trying to get back Amphipolis. Not because of Brasidas perdu à jamais, lost forever. And we know that there are alliances, that we know that they support, we know about the Battle of Mantinea, the Second Battle of Mantinea, and we know also of the interest of Athenians, as you mentioned, Phocion, in institutions of Sparta. So it is really very, very plausible. And we know very well, Edward wrote about it, and also other people that wrote about it, Sparta knew very well in military affairs to find a solution. Remember how quickly she found the solution in when the two kings came back from Eleusis. The day after, they didn't allow anymore both kings to be head of the army. One should stay Sparta or being involved in other, but only one person should. And there are also other things. So I probably during the Hellenistic period, and it's not a coincidence that we have evidence about Sparta, Athens, and Thasos, because these areas have big hori, big, large territories, and the territories need inspection needs protection under certain circumstances. At Athens, this is during the period of wars. Thassos has also a hora, and a difficult hora. So, introducing cryptoi, this savoir-faire of the Macedonians.
We might contrast the Athenian response during the Decalaean War, where there's hypothetically no crypteia.
It's not so quickly, please. Yes?
We might contrast the Athenian response during the Decalaean War, where there is no crypteia to control the landscape. And so you have mess, slavers, desertion, and then Hellenistic, they develop a crypteia.
Yes, it is later, but don't forget also that these relations become very close in the 4th century and yet later during the Hellenistic period, when Sparta is against the Macedonians from the beginning, plain like a demonion, and Athens suffers under the Macedonians for a long period of time. So there are different needs. But thank you very much. I will see that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we should break for lunch because, again, I'm sure we're very hungry. But apologies again for all the technical problems today, but I hope we have got to the end. But I think, despite all of that, and in face of many obstacles, we've had a fantastic series of papers this morning. So I'd like to thank Professor Psoma and also all of the speakers we've had this morning. Thank you very much. So, and actually, shall we do the round of applause first? Thank you. So apologies again. I hope you had a longer break earlier, but we're going to have a shorter lunch break. So if we could aim to start again at 2:15. So that should give us 35 minutes. Lunch is outside, so I hope that will make it easier to have a shorter lunch break. But apologies again for the change.